Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today to look through this lovely anthology. I hope that you all are enjoying these look-through videos as much as I am. They certainly are a good way of sharing some of the informative, historical things that I have been fortunate enough to come across in my life, and the things that have informed my own perspective and consciousness. So I'm very glad to share them with you. This is a really big coffee table style book. And it's full of a lot of interesting little things from various timepieces and different lesbian figures. So, yeah, there's a lot in here to chew through. I'm going to do what I usually do and kind of flip through the book and share pieces with you. How is everybody doing? I see that we have 5 viewers so far, so be sure to say hi. I have recently rearranged my setup here as well, so this is the first time I'm actually filming from this location, and we're going to see how it goes as well. There's a lot that I've been working on at home lately. So yeah. Well, since nobody's feeling chatty, I'm going to get started looking through this. I need to move my microphone too. Yeah, I don't really have it set up yet to know what's going to be right. This book's a little worn. I picked it up used. I don't remember where I found it exactly, but yeah, there's a good deal of wear and tear on this book. This says, "We dedicate this volume to all lesbians, past and present, who have helped create and who go on creating our culture, and to those lesbians of the future who will continue to create it. More particularly, we dedicate it to Sarah Valentine and Catherine Flume, whose love and support are central in our lives." These are the table of contents, and as you can see, it's pretty intense here. Some of the things that pop out to me. Part 1 is Women Who Did Stand Alone. And it's got some really great pieces in here that I'm already familiar with. The cool thing about this book is it's an anthology, so they take a lot of different pieces of writing and kind of just throw them together. Part 2, We Are Not As They Say. And Part 3, New Ground. Yeah. There is a good deal of stuff in here. Okay. Preface by Sarah Dreyer. For those of us who come of age as lesbians in the mid-decades of the 20th century, the world was a lonely and frightening place. If we knew or guiltily guessed that we loved women more than men, we stood alone. If we looked around for someone to tell us what that meant, what kind of people we were, what kind of life we could expect to live, there was no one there. We turned to the media and saw ourselves depicted as sick, desperate, dangerous, ugly, predatory, sleazy, and doomed to desperate lives that would end badly. Lesbians were all alike, we were told, and these man-imitating women who hung around young women were who we were. No wonder so many of us fled into dishonest marriages or accepted the stereotypes and tried to live them. No wonder some chose to accept and repeat the heterosexual patriarchal image with which they were presented. No wonder some of us looked at the future and seeing only the same loneliness, the same despair, killed ourselves. Pretty heavy. Preface by Elena Dykewoman. I'm going to skip over her writing because of several reasons don't want to get into here, but lesbian identity, lesbian communities, and lesbian culture, creating our survival. Defining lesbian culture is interesting. We were aware that creating an anthology, even imperfectly representative of lesbian culture, presupposed a definition, however fuzzy, of what we consider lesbian culture to be, but it would be presumptuous to attempt an all-encompassing definition of our culture when we can't agree on a definition of lesbian. The purpose of a collection such as this, and of the culture generally, can be seen as expressing the values of the lesbian community, or at least of values shared across lesbian communities. Lesbian culture is whatever lesbians do. Several of our lesbian correspondents suggested that lesbian culture is anything that lesbians do: theorizing, physics, raising children, making love, throwing tires on an assembly line. But there are problems with equating lesbian culture with the mere presence of lesbians doing anything at all. Such activities and roles certainly occur in a social context, but they are not uniquely lesbian. Lesbians aren't identified by what we do because the things we do are pretty much the same things that non-lesbians do. And this includes the sexual activities we engage with other lesbians, we engage in with other lesbians. What is uniquely lesbian is the way in which we do them and who we choose to act with and for. What identifies us is the focus of our lives: other lesbians, other queers, other women. Depending on our self-identification and the politics that enacts our identification, virtually no lesbians, except those who still live as though they were heterosexual, live in ways that recenter of our lives. Okay, no, come on, dude. My cat's acting up, which is a typically lesbian thing, right? Come on, baby. Come here. Lesbians get interrupted by their cats. Yeah. Where were we? I know you've got too much energy right now. Too much energy. I shouldn't have fed you. I should have ignored you. Okay, so where were we? Stop. Okay, let's see. Live in ways that recenter or require us to place het men at the center of our lives. In her letter to us, Diane Griffin Crowder, noting that there are so many different lesbian cultures, went on to remark, come on, ooh, stop. The one thing that most lesbians seem to have in common is the more or less conscious rejection of the societal imperative that women must define ourselves in relation to men. In fact, it is the indifference to men that society finds so threatening. The act of women defining ourselves without respect to men is so subversive that it alone is sufficient to account for all the backlash lesbians experience. Monique Wittig's image of lesbians as runaway slaves in Virgile Non, blah, 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 is pertinent here because in a slave society, even the runaway or freed slave is still always defined as a once or future slave. She must, in order to create a new self-definition, find a way to break out of the slave-master female-male dichotomy. Thus, at this juncture in our efforts to develop a culture, we still find ourselves faced with both rejecting heterosexist definitions and simultaneously trying to envision what lies beyond those dualisms. Whether one looks at fiction, at art, at music, or at such manifestations as dress, etc., we constantly find these tensions between destroying the old and building the new. Unfortunately, all too often, we have not got beyond simple rejection or reversal of heterosexual values and concepts. But despite all the difficulties, lesbian culture at least rejects the notion that women can exist only in a dialectical relation with men, and that is the beginning of a new exploration. Lesbian culture reflects our motives and values. Unwilling to accept an all-inclusive definition of lesbian culture, one which allows for the existence of lesbian culture wherever and whenever one or more of us is engaging in any activity at all. Some of our correspondents said that lesbian culture was distinguished from our cultures of origin and the dominant heteropatriarchal culture by how and why we do things. Our activities and interactions can be said to be part of lesbian culture when they reflect lesbian sensibility, a set of assumptions and priorities uniquely lesbian. We assume the responsibility for for learning to treat each other as we wish to be treated, for acting in ways that reflect and develop our awareness of self and community. There is then an implicit valuing of ourselves and other lesbians, informing what has been called lesbian sensibility. Although lesbians have only begun to articulate values, it is nonetheless true, as Alex Dobkin has asserted, that this method is the basis of our interactions. We agree to attend to each other, and therefore, according to Dobkin, to learn how to properly treat each other. Lesbian culture, a culture apart, a culture under siege. The more things change, the more they stay the same, huh? Several writers noted that lesbian culture was a culture under siege. Like individual lesbians, lesbian culture is threatened by males and by the power they wield. Male-dominated media and the social, economic, and political institutions whose assumptions they promulgate are constant threats to lesbian existence and lesbian culture. Lesbian culture exists in opposition to this dominant culture and reflects lesbian resistance to its values. There are, of course, those lesbians who say they're very happy with the status quo, who say they have no reason for wanting social change. Still, there are many other lesbians who are not happy with the dominant culture, who work hard to promote a wide range of changes in the structures and attitudes of U.S. society, who want nothing less than a full-scale revolution that will sweep white men from power and keep them from regaining power in the future. These are the lesbians responsible for creating and maintaining lesbian culture. Ain't that the truth? It is such lesbians who require lesbian culture for their and our very survival. I'm going to move on from here. Part 4, lesbian culture is informed by lesbian sensibility. Many of those who wrote offering their thoughts on lesbian culture emphasized the visionary, transformative political... Oh, God. Reading this upside down is hard. And you can't see it anyway, so I'm going to turn it around just so I can read it better for you. Many of those who wrote offering their thoughts on lesbian culture emphasized the visionary, transformative potential of identifying lesbian values, of articulating how we want to interact with, how we want to be among other lesbians. They stressed that lesbian culture was not simply established in opposition to hostile male culture, but in response to the new ways we perceive the world and the new ways we therefore choose to act in it. As a culture in opposition, lesbian culture certainly draws upon our conscious absenting of ourselves from patriarchal culture and our rejection of its heterosexual imperative. Perhaps more importantly, however, it simultaneously draws upon our presence as lesbians to each other. Lesbian culture must at once repudiate the values of heteropatriarchal culture and establish distinct values which reflect a uniquely lesbian sensibility. Lesbian identity and lesbian culture, an attempt at synthesis. If we claim that lesbian culture is at once a turning away from males and patriarchal culture and a turning toward other lesbians, we may seem to have defined it to an extent. At least we have suggested what its origins are, leaving to its artifacts the creation of others, the burden of demonstrating how lesbian culture manifests this dual focus. But many have argued that the issue of lesbian identity itself, the question of who is and who isn't or wasn't a lesbian, must be settled before we can talk about lesbian culture or lesbian community in any meaningful way. This is actually really important stuff and very, I think, very critical at this juncture in time, because definitely I have noticed a lack of ability for most lesbians to agree on even a definition of what that means. And also, even identifying as a lesbian is a lot less popular in the current era. And I think that has to do with a great deal of the backlash that has been wrought against feminism in general. And I think like pieces like this work kind of demonstrate that a big history of lesbian culture has to do with feminism entirely. These two things are fused, and you can't talk about one without the other. To do so is to divorce us from so much of what created and sustained lesbian community for decades. So, yeah. Where was I? And debates about lesbian identity are not trivial or abstract, for as many individual lesbians come to understand, it is possible to be aware that one is different without knowing exactly how one is different. Word. Possible to understand vaguely how one is different from others while remaining unaware that there are others like herself. Possible to know that there are others like oneself, other lesbians, without having a label or a precise sense of how she is like them. Although, as we shall argue, lesbian culture is an important source of lesbian identity, lesbian culture is also dependent upon a paradox which is more apparent than it is real. Lesbian culture arises from a lesbian sense of self. Compiling an anthology of works identified as lesbian culture presupposes an idea of who is a lesbian. As Georgette Harper pointed out in Towards a Lesbian Aesthetic in 1990, there is something that resonates in us when we feel a lesbian sensibility emanating from art. Lesbians, even lesbians who aren't out to themselves yet, often gravitate towards works by lesbians that have no explicit content and which they do not realize were created by lesbians. For example, lesbians have been quick to recognize the lesbian focus of Sappho, despite many absurd arguments by academics and homophobes that she was not, quote-unquote, really a lesbian. If some of us spend some amount of time not being out to ourselves, if some of us are lifelong lesbians, while others are, in Marilyn Murphy's words, lesbians come lately, if some women live all their lives loving women without calling themselves lesbians, while others who are heterosexual or bisexual insist upon labeling themselves as lesbians, and they claim thereby broadening the definition of lesbian, how can we establish a definition of lesbian that most lesbians, we aren't so optimistic as to hope for agreement by all, will agree with? We concede that lesbian identity, like other identities, arises within a social and communal context. Like other marginal and outcast identities, our first inkling of difference begins with the realization that we are not like them, heterosexuals. I see Radical by Choices here. Hello. I seem to have trouble with the chat right now. Okay. It's saying that it's unable to connect for me. So I don't know how it's all looking for you, and this is kind of why it is important to let's say something in the chat, just because I don't know how it's working otherwise. Also, would like to know if there are any lesbians watching this too, so be sure to pop in and speak for yourself. Because it is interesting how many people are interested in lesbian culture who aren't lesbians as well. So, yeah, they're talking about the realization that we're not like them, the heterosexuals. And so our initial sense of who we are is largely negative based on who we are not or who we are told we ought to be. Our positive sense of lesbian identity is thoroughly communal in that it depends upon our ability to find other lesbians and then to establish a niche for ourselves amongst them. Though we agree that lesbian identity arises within a communal context, we wish to contest the arguments which might be advanced by those who believe that a clear, indisputable sense of lesbian identity must be shared by a large community of lesbians, each of whom arrived at her identity in isolation from other lesbians, before lesbian culture can be said to exist. This anthology is premature, they might say, because lesbian culture does not yet exist. Lesbian culture can't yet exist for two reasons. First, lesbian communities exist within larger communities, many of whose interests they share, rather than in a comparative isolation with a set of specific and clearly defined behaviors and interests. And second, we haven't yet established what lesbian identity is, how it can be defined, or how it is formed. In our, Julia and Susan's discussion of lesbian culture, we may seem to have taken a shared definition of lesbian for granted, presuming that we all know what we mean when we refer to lesbians, or to a lesbian sense of self. But as we've just suggested, there has been a great deal of contemporary controversy surrounding the issue of lesbian identity. Academics and other intellectuals have debated the meaning of the word lesbian, noting that there are problems with its use. There is no universal agreement upon how it should be defined, they argue. Can we, for instance, assign the term to those women in history for whom no sexual activity can be proven? Can we use it to refer to women who lived and loved women when the term lesbian identified only dwellers of Lesbos? Even those who would call ourselves lesbians seem unable to arrive at a consensus. As in the past, there are, of course, many women who are afraid to identify themselves as lesbians, and often with good reason. In recent years, we have heard and read women whose primary sexual and emotional relationship is with a man insist that they are lesbians. I mean, yeah, I've seen that nowadays too. Why, lesbians might ask, would men and non-lesbian women wish to claim lesbian identities for themselves in the face of the persecution endured by lesbians? And why would they expect us to believe such claims? What does it mean, according to them, to call oneself a quote-unquote lesbian, and what does it mean to us when we do so? Because the second of these two questions concerns the very definition of the word identify, not to mention that the word lesbian, will address it first. For most of us speakers, what a word means is connected intimately with the circumstances under which we would use it. So we expect to be able to list or at least hint at those characteristics an individual or group needs to have before we'd use a certain word to describe it. As our discussion of lesbian culture suggests, both we and our contributors use lesbian to refer to a woman whose emotional and sexual energies are directed toward other women and not toward men. We also extend its meaning to refer to ways of thinking and behaving that draw upon this primary identification, particularly when a lesbian has become self-aware and consciously seeks out others like herself. 15 years ago, these uses of the word lesbian might have seemed logical and obvious. Recently, though, many theorists have decided that common sense, like identity, is merely the product of social consensus, that both are really constructed by social and cultural forces, In that case, since there are no quote-unquote real lesbians, but only those constructed in and by a hostile heteropatriarchal culture, the term lesbian can be appropriated by anyone, used willy-nilly to label anyone and any form of behavior. Such theories are undoubtedly clever, and many seem to have found them liberating. But given the very real threats confronting real lesbians, the arrogation of the word lesbian by men and non-lesbian women strikes us as one more threat, the threat, once again, of erasure and invisibility, of the denial that there are, in fact, women who choose to love other women. We exist physically and materially, as well as emotionally. When a woman has identified herself as a lesbian in this way, she asserts that she is a lesbian. Those of us who have done so, at whatever personal cost, resent intensely the efforts of others to appropriate the word and assume, when they find it convenient or politically expedient, what they believe to be a lesbian identity. To the extent that a conscious sense of self arises within a communal context from the awareness of what one is in relation to others, we can establish a positive lesbian identity only in a lesbian communal context, the only one in which a positive lesbian identity can be constructed. Our claim, then, is that the relationships among lesbian identity, lesbian community, and lesbian culture are not linear and unidirectional. Lesbian identity is a turning towards other women, emotionally, physically, sexually, and a turning away from males, from heterosexual feelings and acts, and finally from male-dominated culture. Lesbian identity expresses itself through seeking out not only individual women to love, but communities in which we find ourselves lovingly reflected, and a culture which expresses those reflections. However, it is also within those communities, and within the context of that culture, that each woman coming to a sense of her identity as a lesbian can best find herself among other lesbians, contemplating and enjoying lesbian art, seeing images of lesbian selves, turning over the pages of a book with lesbian characters and historical figures, resonating with the self-loving lyrics of lesbian music, laughing at lesbian humor. Each lesbian can come to a proud sense of self, assured and reassured that yes, there are lesbians, and she is one of them. There is wonder in the moment when any of us comes to that sense of awareness in a lesbian community surrounded by the artifacts of lesbian culture. All right, I'm going to move on from here. Here they have a map, the map of Llangollen. This map of Llangollen, home of Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby, the Ladies of Llangollen, appeared in the hardwood papers of the Ladies of Llangollen and Carolyn Hamilton by Mrs. G. H. Bell and published by Macmillan and Co., London in 1930. Yeah. All right, so I've popped out the chat and it looks like I can see you here now. So hi, Sophia. Hi, Francis. Oh, I'm glad you're here, Francis. Hi, Sophia and Cecilia and Francis, and of course, Radical by Choice. And it's good to know that other lesbians are watching. Lesbian History Storytelling by Michael Brody. Remembering as a Way of Life by T.A. Corinne. When death comes into our lives, it is important to note that not to become victims in our own grief, for in the passivity pain may induce, we suffer not only personal losses, but the loss of our own history. Our culture. Somehow we must take the time, summon the energy to write obituaries, to ensure the survival of work, to honor the dead in ways that will be visible and available to succeeding generations. Recently, I attended a Women in Print conference, the third national conference of its kind in the last 10 years. The first conference was held in 1976 outside Omaha, Nebraska, literally in the center of the continent. June Arnold, author and publisher, was a prime mover in conceiving and creating that initial conference. Now in 1985, 3 years after her death, many women attending the third Women in Print conference in Berkeley, California, had never heard of June Arnold. Her books are out of print. Daughters Incorporated, the publishing house, which she co-founded along with her lover, Park Bowman, has ceased to exist. No one, to my knowledge, is working on a biography. This is common within our movement, and it is a disaster. If only you had known June Arnold, understood what she accomplished. The novel without gender-specific pronouns, published anonymously, The Cook and the Carpenter. The novel of older lesbians causing trouble, making love, oral sex when you can finally take your false teeth out. No more beautiful word than withered, Sister Gin. What is radical anyway? What expands our understanding of that which is possible? June Arnold certainly expanded the vision for many of us lesbians and other women who love the written word, the published work, dreams in print. They have one of my favorite poems about lesbian existence, which is A History of Lesbianism by Judy Gran, which I'll read to you now. How they came into the world, the women-loving women, came in 3 by 3 and 4 by 4. The women-loving women came in 10 by 10 and 10 by 10 again, until there were more than you could count. They took care of each other the best they knew how, and of each other's children, if they had any. How they lived in the world, the women-loving women, learned as much as they were allowed, and walked and wore their clothes the way they liked. Whenever they could, they did whatever they knew to be happy or free, and worked and worked and worked. The women-loving women in America were called dykes, and some liked it, and some did not. They made love to each other the best they knew how, and for the best reasons. How they went out of the world, the women-loving women, went out one by one, having withstood greater and lesser trials and much hatred from other people. They went out one by one, each having tried in her own way to overthrow the rule of men over women. They tried it one by one and 100 by 100, until each came in her own way to the end of her life and died. The subject of lesbianism is very ordinary. It's the question of male domination that makes everybody angry. And then they have a beautiful advert here for the Lesbian Herstory Archives in New York City, which I highly suggest if you get a chance to go and visit. I haven't yet. I'm hoping to do it this year. We shall see. But everyone I know that's gone there has found great comfort and joy in what they find. So really, really important to know our history. And that's kind of why I like to share things like this. Excerpts from the Lesbian Archives newsletter, the Gutter Letter, newsletter number 7, December 1981. This letter was found by a gay friend among a stack of papers and boxes lying outside a Greenwich Village apartment house. Attracted by the file folders, he did not realize what they contained until he had lugged the many boxes home. What he found, among many other personal documents, were love letters and photographs portraying the lesbian relationships of a labor activist and educator. She had just died, and these letters had been thrown out as trash. The discovery became symbolic to us, and we refer to the following letter as the Gutter Letter. These documents testifying to our love are too often considered garbage and are destroyed by dismissing or frightened families. This is from 1920, okay? Best beloved, Thursday night. Best beloved, I'm writing by the light of the 2 tall candles on my desk with the flaming chrysanthemums you arranged before me. It's such a lovely, soft glow, and I am glad because this is a candlelight letter. I wish you could know what a wonderful person you are, Eleanor darling, and what joy your letter written last night gave me. Not the part about me. That is pitifully wrong and only a standard for me to measure up to. But you make it all so wonderful and are clear about it. You know, I feel terribly much the way you do about it all, but I could never say so, even in an incoherent fashion. And so many times back of my nobler resolves, I am just plain selfish about wanting you to look at and talk to, especially in the future when I know you won't be there. And that's why you are so wonderful, darling, because now I never can be. But I shall have to strive oh so ardently to ever measure up and be worthy at all of you. The candles are burning low, dear heart, and the world is very still and beautiful outside. And I am so, oh so happy that I know you and love you. And may God bless you through all time. Alice. Thank goodness a gay man found these, right? Mabel Hampton's Coming Out Story, newsletter, December 1981. This piece is from our tape collection, taped at the Coming Out Stories panel, Lesbian Feminist Liberation, June 21st, 1981. I'm Mabel Hampton, and I'm 79 years old. I had one special girlfriend, and then I meets a woman. I mean, she was a real woman. She lived in the life for 7 or 11 years. So I falls hook, line, and sinkin' for this woman. I didn't know what it was all about, but I fell for her. Anyhow, her and I was in this show in Coney Island. So this woman, I will never forget. I was sitting in the middle of the table and she was sitting at the end. All of a sudden, it struck me that I loved this woman. And I know now, I got it down pat. I just loved her. And she looked at me and I looked at her. And I'll tell you the truth. I was so crazy over the woman, why I couldn't even speak. I know that feeling, okay? I'd look at her and she was just like candy. You know, she was a lesbian, and I mean she was one because she knew all the answers and everything else. So that night, I spent the night with her. Then she tells me all the story. She says that she loved me. She came back a week later, and I asked her, did she want to stay with me? We got along nice. I won't tell you what happened. Everything fitted to a T. She came to live with me. In October 1932, Mabel met Lillian Foster, and we stayed together until 4 years ago when she passed away. So you can count how many years we lived together. I must have come out when I was 8 years old. To tell the truth, I never was in, so I must have been out. The Old Moody Gardens Gang, 1950, newsletter number 8, winter 1984. In newsletter number 7, we documented the Old Moody Gardens Gang, a lesbian community from Lowell, Massachusetts that began in the 1950s. The following letter was written by Jean, who was part of the original all-women's band, which played at the Moody Gardens bar. Are you gay? I must have had a very stupid look on my face when Emma asked me that. If she had said queer or lesbian, I would have known what she was talking about, but the word gay didn't mean anything to me. When I realized what she meant, I clung to the word, feeling at last a name I could swallow. Gay. When I was asked to play at the Silver Star Cafe in the 50s, there wasn't a place around for the gay people, and the few friends you had found would get together, but always felt that fear of being asked to leave a bar or physically being hurt when you left the bar at night. But here was a chance to be myself and be accepted for what I was. We started playing Friday, Saturday, and Sundays all day, and within a short time, you had to be there early to get a seat. The kids poured in, and even though it was still a straight bar, we outnumbered the straights 4-1. And sometimes more than that. They came from all around, some traveling for 2 or 3 hours just for an evening with us. It was our Mecca. We were family, and we had found a home. There's 2 poems here by Renee Vivian. One is called Prolong the Night, and the other is called The Touch. I think I'm going to skip these. And then there is some excerpts from the Well of Loneliness. Which is it's a historic lesbian love story that's actually really typically sad. So I think I will skip that. I'm going to read this a couple of paragraphs from this one. This is Elsa, I Come With My Songs, the autobiography of Elsa Gidlow. Of course, those who did not get married, and even those who did for economic or family reasons, an heir was needed, or they did not like being old maids. Once married, they were freer anyway. The men went off to posts in India, Africa, or the colonies. And when they were left alone, some quietly turned back to one another. No one criticized or condemned. People may not have thought or known there could be anything to condemn. Some people imagine women have no bodies below the navel. We drew closer to one another, below the navel, laughing. She asked me if I had heard the story about Queen Victoria's response to women's relationships. As we lay beside one another, listening to the gentle rain, she told the following story. A proposed law concerning sexual practices between men, then called buggery or sodomy, was set before Queen Victoria for approval. Then someone asked if women should not also be included in the legal strictures. Women, she is reported to have laughed. What could the poor things do? Little did she know. Throughout the European continent and in England, even among Victoria's own court ladies, women were finding and loving each other, and some in lifelong relationships. I'm talking with Frank Harris. I learned a little about that, I told her. You discussed that with him? He guessed about me, probably from reading my poetry to women, and from what he considered my boyishness. He sometimes called me androgyne. He thought I should write about it frankly, in prose as well as poetry. Tommy wasn't sure that would be advisable. He probably wouldn't get it published. Tommy's general feeling was, then and later, what the average person did not know wouldn't hurt them. So there's like a lot of little stories in here, or they're like not little stories, but there's excerpts from stories at the beginning here. Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon. These were the founders of the Daughters of Bilitis, the first national lesbian organization in the U.S., and also authors of Lesbian/Women. Very lovely photo. There is a poem called, or not a poem, a play called Hollandia, which I am skipping. The cool thing about this book is, like, every time I bring it out, hi Naomi, I am consistently, like, finding new things. So yeah, there's a whole play in here if you ever want to do an old lesbian play. Or you could write your own too. But I like to go back in history sometimes more than I like to see new things. So this is interesting. This is a advert from a lesbian coffee house, which has got a few lesbian themed events happening. Beyond coupledom, perhaps our lover relationships are the center of what makes us lesbians. But lesbian life, lesbian culture is much more than simply what we do with our lovers. Our history is rich with connections and resources. Sometimes we've had lesbian ball games, bars, discussion groups, community centers, consciousness-raising groups, newspapers, social networks, musical groups, card clubs, dances, circles of friends, work crews. Some are all or none of the above. Sometimes our lovers were all we had. What got you through? The next evening of lesbian history storytelling at Mountain Moving Coffee House is coming up, and we are looking for women to tell their 5 to 8 minute stories about some aspect of their lesbian lives before 1980. Something that gave joy, meaning, or perhaps simply survival. It could be a friend, a club, a sports team, a bar, a book, an event, you name it. Tell us a story. You can tell your own story from the stage. Write your story for someone else to read. Tell your story on tape ahead of time, and we will edit and transcribe it for someone else to read. Please call. And so Martha and Michael left their numbers on here as well. And it was a benefit for Sinister Wisdom, which is still in print. Excerpts from a novel. This is interesting. I'm going to read a little bit of this. This is Butch Femme Relationships, Sexual Courage in the 1950s. For many years now, I've been trying to figure out how to explain the special nature of butch femme relationships to lesbian feminists who consider butch femme a reproduction of heterosexual models. My own roots lie deep in the earth of this lesbian custom, and what follows is one lesbian's understanding of her own experience. In the late 50s, I walked the streets looking so butch that straight teenagers called me a bull dyke. However, when I went to the Sea Colony, a working-class lesbian bar in Greenwich Village, looking for my friends, and sometimes for a lover, I was a femme, a woman who loved and wanted to nurture the butch strength in other women. I am now 40 years old. Although I have been a lesbian for over 20 years and I embrace feminism as a worldview, I can spot a butch 30 feet away and still feel the thrill of her power. Contrary to belief, this power is not bought at the expense of the femme's identity. Butch femme relationships, as I experienced them, were complex erotic statements, not phony heterosexual replicas. They were filled with a deeply lesbian language of stance, dress, gesture, loving, courage, and autonomy. None of the butch women I was with, and this included a passing woman, ever presented themselves to me as men. They did announce themselves as tabooed women who were willing to identify their passion for other women by wearing clothes that symbolized the taking of responsibility. Part of this responsibility was sexual expertise. In the 1950s, this courage to feel comfortable with arousing another woman became a political act. Butch Femme was an erotic partnership serving both as a conspicuous flag of rebellion and as an intimate exploration of women's sexuality. It was not an accident that butch femme couples suffered the most street abuse and provoked more assimilated or closeted lesbians to plead with them not to be so obvious. An excerpt from a letter by Lorraine Hansberry published in the Ladder in 1957 shows the political implications of the butch femme statement. The letter is a plea for discretion because I believe of the erotic clarity of the butch femme visual image. Someday I expect the discreet lesbian will not turn her head on the streets at the sight of a butch strolling hand in hand with her friend in their trousers and definitive haircuts. But for the moment, it still disturbs. It creates an impossible area for discussion with one's most enlightened, to the use of a hopeful term, heterosexual friends. A critic of this essay has suggested that what was really the problem here was that many other lesbians at that time felt the adoption of culturally defined roles by the butch femme was not a true picture of the majority of lesbians. They found these socialized roles a limiting reality and therefore did not wish to have the butch femme viewpoint applied or expressed as their own. My sense of the time says this was not the reason. The butch femme couple embarrassed other lesbians and still does because they made lesbians culturally visible, a terrifying act for the 1950s. Hansberry's language, the words discreet and definitive, is the key. For it speaks of what some wanted to keep hidden, the clearly sexual implications of the two women together. The latter advocated a mode of behavior and dress acceptable to society, and it was this policy Hansberry was praising. The desire for passing, combined with the radical work of survival that the latter was undertaking, was a paradox created by the America of the 50s. The writing in the latter was bringing to the surface years of pain, opening a door on an intensely private experience, giving a voice to an obscene population in a decade of McCarthy witch hunts. To survive meant to take a public stance of societal cleanliness. But in the pages of the journal itself, all dimensions of lesbian life were explored, including butch femme relationships. The latter brought off a unique balancing act for the 1950s. It gave nourishment to a secret and subversive life while it flew the flag of assimilation. However, it was not the rejection by our own that taught the most powerful lesson about sex, gender, and class that the butch femme represented, but the anger we provoked on the streets, since at times femmes dressed similarly to their butch lovers. The aping of heterosexual roles was not always visually apparent, yet the sight of us was enraging. My understanding of why we angered straight spectators so is not that they saw us modeling ourselves after them, but just the opposite. We were a symbol of women's erotic autonomy, a sexual accomplishment that did not include them. The physical attacks were a direct attempt to break into this self-sufficient erotic partnership. The most frequently shouted taunt was, "Which one of you is the man?" This was not a reflection of our lesbian experience as much as it was a testimony to the lack of erotic categories in straight culture. In the 50s, when we walked in the village holding hands, we knew we were courting violence. But we also knew the political implications of how we were courting each other and chose not to sacrifice our need to their anger. The irony of social change has made a radical sexual political statement of the 1950s appear today as a reactionary, non-feminist experience. This is one reason I feel I must write about the old times. Not to romanticize butch-femme relationships, but to salvage a period of lesbian culture that I know to be important. A time that has been too easily dismissed as the decade of self-hatred. 2 summers ago in Kansas at the National Women's Studies Association conference, a slideshow was presented to the Lesbian Caucus in which a series of myths about lesbians was entertainingly debunked. The show was to be used in straight sex education classrooms. One of the slides was a comic representation of the myth of butch-femme relationship, the quote-unquote myth of butch-femme relationships with voiceover something like, in the past, lesbians copied heterosexual styles, calling themselves butch and femme, but they no longer do so. I waited until the end to make my statement, but I sat there feeling that we were so anxious to clean up our lives for heterosexual acceptance that we were ready to force our own people into a denial of some deep part of their lives. I knew what a butch or femme woman would feel seeing this slideshow, and I realized the price for social or superficial feminist acceptance was too high. If we deny the subject of butch-femme relationships, we deny the women who lived them and still do. Because of the complexity and authenticity of the butch-femme experience, I think we must take another look at the term role-playing, used primarily to summarize this way of loving. I do not think the term serves a purpose either as a label or as a description of the experience. As a femme, I did what was normal for me, what felt right. I did not learn a part. I perfected a way of loving. The artificial labels stood waiting for us as we discovered our sexualities. We labeled ourselves as part of our cultural ritual, and the language reflected our time in history. But the words which seem so one-dimensional now stood for complex sexual and emotional exchanges. Women who were new to the life and entered bars have reported they were asked, "Well, what are you, butch or femme?" Many fled rather than answer the question. The real questions behind this discourse were, are you sexual? And are you safe? When one moved beyond the opening gambits, a whole range of sexuality was possible. Butch and femme covered a wide variety of sexual responses. We joked about being a butchy femme or a femmy butch, or feeling kiki, going both ways. We joked about a reversal of expectations. Get a butch home and she turns over on her back. We had a code language for a courageous world for which many paid dearly. It is hard to recreate for the 1980s what lesbian sexual play meant in the 50s, but I think it is essential for lesbian feminists to understand without shame this part of their erotic heritage. I also think the erotic for us as a colonized people is part of our social struggle to survive and change the world. A year ago, some friends of mine were discussing their experiences and talking about butch-femme relationships to a women's studies class. Both had been gay since the 50s and were active in the early gay liberation struggles. I tried to explain the complex nature of butch sexuality, its balance of strength and delicacy. Madeline said, "The commitment to please each other was totally different from that in heterosexual relationships in which the woman existed to please the man." As she spoke, I realized that not only was there the erotic statement made by the two women together, but there was and still is a butch sexuality and a femme sexuality, not a woman acting like a man or a woman acting like a woman's sexuality, but a developed lesbian-specific sexuality that has a historical setting and a cultural function. For instance, as a femme, I enjoyed strong, fierce lovemaking, deep, strong givings and takings, erotic play challenges, calculated teasings that called forth the butch femme encounter. But the essential pleasure was that we were two women, not masqueraders. When a woman said, "Give it to me, baby," as I strained to take more of her hand inside of me, oh my God. I had never heard the voice of a man or of a socially conditioned roles. I heard the call of a woman world traveler, a brave woman whose hands challenged every denial laid on a woman's life. Anyway, this is an interesting quote here. I am not a woman, I am a lesbian. Which is often, I think, this is a statement that's often misinterpreted. But specifically, it speaks to the fact that many lesbians have seen that to be a lesbian is inherently to reject the social role of woman and therefore to stand apart from it, not as opposed some sort of rejection of like our sex as such, but of the role that is said to define our sex. So this is a photo of Mabel Hampton, who we heard from earlier in this book. This is an excerpt from Zammy, A New Spelling of My Name by Audre Lorde. I will read the intro. I remember how being young and black and gay and lonely felt. A lot of it was fine, feeling I had the truth and the light and the key, but a lot of it was purely hell. There were no mothers, no sisters, no heroes. We had to do it alone, like our sister Amazons, the riders on the loneliest outposts of the kingdom of Dahomey. We, young and black and fine and gay, sweated out our first heartbreaks with no school nor office chums to share that confidence over lunch hour, just as there were no rings to make tangible the reason for our happy secret smiles. There were no names nor reason given or shared for the tears that messed up the lab reports or the library bills. We were good listeners and never asked for double dates. But didn't we know the rules? Why did we always seem to think friendships between women were important enough to care about? Always we moved in a necessary remoteness that made, "What did you do this weekend?" seem like an impertinent question. We discovered and explored our attention to women alone, sometimes in secret, sometimes in defiance, sometimes in little pockets that almost touched. Why are those little black girls always whispering together or fighting, but always alone against a greater aloneness? We did it cold turkey, and although it resulted in some pretty imaginative, tough women when we survived, too many of us did not survive at all. I remember Muff, who sat on the same seat in the same dark corner of the pony stable bar, drinking the same gin year after year. One day she slipped off onto the floor and died of a stroke right there between the stools. We found out later her real name was Josephine. During the 50s in the village, I didn't know the few other black women who were visibly gay at all well. Too often we found ourselves sleeping with the same white women. We recognized ourselves as exotic sister outsiders who might gain little from banding together. Perhaps our strength might lay in our fewness, our rarity. That was the way it was downtown and uptown, meaning the land of the black people. Seemed very far away and hostile territory. Sometimes we'd pass black women on 8th Street, the invisible but visible sisters, or in the bag or at Laurel's, and our glances might cross, but we never looked into each other's eyes. We acknowledged our kinship by passing in silence, looking the other way. Still, we were always on the lookout, Flea and I, for that telltale flick of the eye, that certain otherness prohibited openness of expression, that definiteness of voice which would suggest, "I think she's gay." After all, doesn't it take one to know one? Annie's Steiner was my first great love when I was a baby butch in Florida, 16 years old, just coming out, and still too inexperienced to know how to make a proper pass. She lived down the dormitory hall from me in room 217, one of the 2 private rooms on the floor, and actually I had a crush on her room before I ever saw Annie Steiner in the flesh. The very air around her door carried a sense of mystery, felt loaded with something very special and intriguing. Sometimes when I passed that door at night, I could see a blue light shining at the crack above the floor, and I could smell the perfume of incense burning. The first time I ever saw Annie Steiner, the woman who lived in that mysterious room, she was striding hurriedly down the hallway toward me, head down, shoulders hunched, hands deep in the pockets of her trench coat, which was belted and had the collar up all the way around. The blonde curls on top of her head bobbed with her steps, and her brows were knit in a frown. I immediately guessed who she was. She was so beautiful that I was too stunned to say anything or even to smile. She never looked at me. She passed me, stepped in front of the door, numbered 217, opened the lock, and let herself in. I had to know who she was. I began to ask around the dorm if anyone knew the girl who lived in room 217. The other girls just shrugged. No one seemed to know her or anything about her at all. My frustration mounted. Then one evening, I brought the subject up among a group of girls who were visiting from a neighboring dorm, and I was rewarded. Kathy knew. Not only that, she was more than willing to discuss the subject. The mysterious girl was in Kathy's science lab, and Kathy sometimes had to work with her. Her name was Annie Steiner. She was older, almost 21. She was a beatnik. She had BO. She was unfriendly. She didn't hang out with anyone. Kathy didn't care much for her. Since I didn't care much for Kathy, that was a point in Annie Steiner's favor. I began to wander the hallway of my dorm, finding any excuse to go down to the other end of the corridor so that I could pass room 217 on the off chance of being able to bump into Annie Steiner either coming or going. Days went by and I never saw her, but now that I knew her name, I'd whisper it under my breath, an incantation designed to woo her to me. Come on, Annie Steiner. Come on, Annie, baby. Annie, come out of your room. Annie Steiner, come see me. It didn't work. Then I had a real stroke of good fortune. I was talking with a group of people one day about having been to New York the summer before, and someone said, "Oh, there's a girl in your dorm who's from New York. Do you know her?" "No, I don't think so. Who is she?" I replied, interested. "Her name's Annie Steiner. I think she's from New York. She's a little weird." I got this tremendous rush. My head spun, and my heart started to beat fast. Annie? Annie Steiner, the mysterious girl in room 217, was from New York? Well, it made perfect sense, and it certainly explained her strangeness. I realized that this fact could be my pass to get to her, my excuse to connect with her. I began to rehearse in my mind what I would say and do, how I would approach her. I'd knock on the door to room 217. She'd open it, look at me questioningly. "Hi," I'd say. "I hear you're from New York. I've been there too. Why don't we talk about New York for a while?" And she'd invite me in, and I'd go into that wonderful room, and just the idea alone was so overwhelmingly ecstatic for me that I could conceive no more, could not imagine what might happen next. I went over and over the scenario in my mind, preparing it, rehearsing it, and rehearsing it, savoring it. I decided to put it into action that very night. Oh my God, what a weirdo. Let's see. Rings Zippo light up the past. Looking through the old jewelry box can sure stir up memories. Everything from the antique granny glasses of my long hair radical days to my last and favorite Zippo lighter from the bars is piled hodgepodge and strange marriages. First, in a great inextractable clump, come the necklaces, the dainty little girl atrocities that never succeeded in turning me into a dainty little girl are twisted with the worry beads from my hippy-dippy years. Some I bought at a wonderful bead shop down the block from Andy Warhol's Electric Circus. Worry beads in the windows, worry beads on the walls, worry beads on the whirling racks. There was a style for every freak head and lefty college kid in the metropolitan area. Each bead was a different color, and under the right chemical influence had universes of significance. My gym whistle, lying under the necklaces, is testimony to an earlier life. I bought it at the same time that I got my volleyball rule book in high school. I'd probably never felt prouder than the first time I walked across the volleyball court, Miss Burchelli watching to referee. I wore the whistle like a badge. Finally, I had a place, some status in the world. This is a little relatable because I have similar experiences when I go through my jewelry box. Ring Zippo, Light Up the Past by Lee Lynch. I'm going to read the last paragraph. I spent last weekend at a women's gathering high in the Oregon mountains. We pitched our tent alongside a raucously babbling creek. At the craft fair, a woman sold natural jewelry, the kind we dykes liked so much. I fell for a handsome necklace of hematite, a silvery black stone reputed to have a grounding effect on its wearer. Later, I ran into a lesbian real estate agent friend who'd bought one too. On the spot, we declared it a butch stone. I'll wear it until it goes into my jewelry box, like my gym whistle, my pinky rings, like the Zippo in my pocket. For Joan in 1967, by Beth Carb. I once had a friend who drove a school bus for a living, a woman well into her 40s who wore her hair bleached, a brassy red, and tied back in a curly tail. She wore eye makeup thick and heavy and white lipstick and talked tough like New Yorkers can talk tough, and she smiled to rock and folk and peace music in a way that others in their 40s just didn't back then. I once had a friend who saved my life, who drove that school bus to my front door every day of the last 2 years I endured high school, stopping on the street in front of my house and risking her job every time she did. And she kept on doing it, driving that school bus right up to my house and knocking at 7 in the morning, honking so anyone could hear and see that school bus she drove right up to my house. I once had a friend who saved my life. That school bus waiting for me at 7 o'clock and the brassy, red-headed, tough-talking woman who drove it, waiting for me to come out of my house, clutching books tied to my chest and the burden of the day ahead. It was 7 o'clock. And the brassy, red-headed, tough-talking woman talked softly to me, sitting in that big leather seat, smiling to the radio, to the rock and folk and peace music, in a way that others in their 40s just didn't back then. I once had a friend who saved my life, drove that school bus right up to my house so I wouldn't have to wait on the corner 2 blocks up. So I wouldn't have to wait on the corner with a dozen or so kids my age, wait for the school bus, among taunts and jeers and words like queer and lesy, clutching books tight to my chest and the burden of the day ahead. That brassy, red-headed, tough-talking woman drove that school bus and let me on before anyone else. Smiled at the radio and talked softly to me as I rode in the seat just behind her. That seat made for 2 that nobody else would occupy even after the bus filled up with kids standing in the aisle. I once had a friend who saved my life, smiled at the radio and talked softly to me as I rode in the seat just behind her, who never said the words queer or lesy, or let anyone else say them either. In that seat just behind her, that seat made for 2 that nobody else would occupy even after the bus filled up with kids standing in the aisle. I once had a friend. Originally published in Sinister Wisdom 40, spring 1990. Quite nice. Let's move on a bit. So, part 2, we are not as they say. Adrian Smith, interview by Michael Brody. I came out in 1959 when I was 25 years old. I saw this woman at a meeting who just intrigued me. It was a meeting of the UJA, the United Jewish Appeal. At the time, I was living with a roommate, and she hosted a meeting at our house. I wasn't really involved in it. I was just hanging around, and I saw this woman. Her name was Darlene, and a few days later, she called me on the phone. There was something about a coffee pot. I think she had brought a coffee pot over for the meeting. So I decided to return the coffee pot to her. I don't think I left her apartment for days after that. And it was funny because I think she was the first lesbian I met, and we spent 15 years together. She was 2 years older than I. She was 27. She'd had experience as a lesbian already, and she had been to New York. She told me all these wonderful stories. I was completely fascinated. I just sat there and listened with my mouth opened. I remember that we were sitting in Maury's, that was a delicatessen on Broadway, and I just sat there for hours entranced, listening to her talk about this world that I never knew existed. I think I was aware before that something was strange about me. I wasn't especially attracted to men, and I thought maybe I was just a failure as a social butterfly. It never occurred to me that I might be a lesbian. So Darlene and I had known each other about a week before I moved in with her, and it lasted 15 years. For a long time, we knew only a handful of other lesbians and gay men. She worked at a bookstore, and there were several there. I started graduate school at the University of Chicago the following year, and I met a couple of people there. There was this couple that Darlene worked for, and we socialized with them. We used to go out to their college often. It was clear that they were lesbians, but I don't think the word was ever used. They were in their 60s at the time, and they'd been together for 25 or 30 years. I'm not sure they ever used the word lesbian, but it was obvious what they were, and we all knew. Basically, the years before Stonewall were a time of great secrecy. I was even secretive with myself, I said. Well, I'm not really a lesbian. I just happen to be living with this woman. It took me a long time to recognize myself as a lesbian. I had a gut feeling that there was something very wrong with me and that I should get it fixed, so I made the rounds of several different therapists, none of whom helped. It was the women's movement that finally made the difference for me. Suddenly I was sane, and it was the rest of them out there who weren't. The women's movement and the gay liberation movement cured me. I was working as a psychologist, and I became more active and involved in the movement. I became more and more out professionally. In 1974, I was invited to be a panelist on the David Susskind Show, one of the early television talk shows. It was going to be done in New York and shown nationally. This was going to be a show on homosexuality, and there were 6 of us on the panel, 3 lesbians, 3 gay men, all of us professionals in various fields. Susskind made a habit of doing one homosexual show a year, kind of a show and tell thing, so that people could see we didn't have horns and a tail. The night before I was supposed to fly to New York, I knew something was wrong because I couldn't sleep. I kept pacing the floor. Suddenly I thought, good Lord, I've got to tell my mother. I'm not certain exactly what I said to her, something like, I'm going to be on the David Susskind show, and there's something I've got to tell you. It's about Darlene and me. You know, we're lesbians. And my mother said, I know. What took you so long to tell me? I said. You knew? Why didn't you ever say anything? And Mother said, it wasn't my place. And she was right. Before the show aired, Darlene decided to tell her mother. She wanted me to come with her. She didn't want to do it by herself. So we took her mother out to dinner. And there was taking off of coats and the sitting down, and finally there was no more putting it off. Darlene said, Adrian just came back from New York, and her mother said, what was Adrian doing in New York? And Darlene answered, well, she was on the David Susskind show, and her mother turned to me and said, what were you doing on the Susskind show? And I said, it was a show on homosexuality. And she said, what were you doing on a show about homosexuality? And Darlene said, we're homosexuals. And her mother said, no, you're not. You're lesbians. She had known it for years. It was sad and typical of the times that we felt so scared and so untrusting, especially with Darlene's mother, because she had known for about 20 years and they had never talked about it. In the years before the movement, we didn't really talk to anyone about being lesbians except each other. I didn't talk about our relationship with anybody else, ever. That's part of what was so difficult. There were no confidants. It became very ingrown. If you were having trouble with a lover, the only one you could talk with it about was that same lover. So she and I were each other's only confidant, only best friend, only everything else. With the coming of the women's movement, there were other options, and so the relationship, which had been so essential until then, lost that quality of desperation, and I think at that point there were enough differences between us that without that, the relationship couldn't survive. To a great extent, relationships were held together by the sense that there was nobody else out there. We couldn't go hunting or seeking. The difference now is wonderful, and in retrospect, I'm so glad to have been a part of that opening up generation. Excerpts from The Female Man by Joanna Russ. Homophobia and Death in the Closet by Marilyn Murphy. I knew of a lesbian couple who were companion lovers for 38 years when death separated them. Nancy had no family to speak of, but Betty Jean's large and nearby family treated Nancy as another daughter and another sister. She was Aunt Nancy to Betty Jean's numerous nieces and nephews. Together the two financed college for the talented but impoverished niece. Together they attended all-important family events, birthdays, graduations, weddings, holiday gatherings. They participated in the ordinary daily life of the family, too. The phone calls, impromptu visits, dinners, and the endless discussions of the relationships of family members to each other, and to in-laws, and to outsiders. Both women felt fortunate to be so lovingly embedded in normal family life as it lived in the USA. They never talked about their own personal life, their own personal disagreements, problems, and joys, of course. It's nobody's business but ours, they'd say. Still, like so many lesbians, they assumed everyone in the family really knew their relationship was lesbian. Nancy and Betty Jean had wills drawn up years before, wills they updated every so often as their assets increased, except for the few bequests of particular objects to others. They were each other's sole beneficiaries. This, as everything else about their personal life, was not talked about, was private. When Betty Jean died, her family assumed that her half of everything was going to them. They were outraged to learn that she had left her possessions to Nancy, a stranger, an outsider, someone she wasn't related to either by blood or marriage. They ransacked the house, shunned Nancy at the funeral, and talked to an attorney about the will. The careful years of legal preparation protected Nancy financially, but nothing could save her from the pain of losing her family when she lost her lover. And they put family in quotations, obviously. Another lesbian I knew lived alone in her lovely canyon home when she became seriously ill. Joanne had almost no contact with her parents and siblings in the 30-some years since she moved to Southern California from a small town in the Midwest. She had a large circle of friends, lesbians and gay men she had known for years. They were her family, all the family she ever wanted. An ex-lover, then her dearest friend, coordinated her care during her last months of life. Friends took turns driving her to treatments, sat with her during the day, and kept a night watch as well. They ran errands, kept her house, helped her get her affairs in order. Joanne spent hours going over her possessions in her mind, deciding which ring or art piece was right for which friend, which lesbian or gay organization was going to get what percentage of her estate. An attorney friend drew up her will. She gave friends instructions about her cremation and memorial service. When the end was near, she had someone contact her blood relatives. To her surprise, they flew in and were confronted with her lesbianism for the first time. They banished Joanne's family of choice from her deathbed. turned them away from the Christian church door and from the cemetery, and broke her will by claiming undue influence over a dying woman. They are now self-righteously spending lesbian money. A friend of my sister died in a boating accident recently. Carmela was in her late 20s, worked for the telephone company, and was very active in the lesbian feminist community. She didn't own much: a good stereo system, a word processor, some furniture, mostly secondhand, and a car, almost paid for. She had a modest savings account and just about every lesbian and feminist book published and every record. She was not out to her parents, and at her death they destroyed her precious books and records and sold what they couldn't use of her things. The money from the sale and from her bank account went to the parish church in her hometown. Oh, that's gross. Stipends for masses offered for the salvation of her soul. Irene and I talked about making wills many times. Once, the morning before we left for an out-of-town conference, we each wrote a simple will on some line stationery and left them on the dining room table, just in case. We felt silly when we saw them on our return. Not long after, we heard that the bereaved but irate family of a gay man acquaintance broke his handwritten will with no trouble at all. We promised to each other to make real wills soon. Of course we didn't. Trouble over money and property when someone dies is not a specifically lesbian and gay man problem. Neither is it only the province of the rich. Still, homophobia does create particular problems for lesbians and gay men. In addition to the ones we share with the larger population, obviously the fact that our companion-lover relationships are not legal creates the greatest difficulty. The legal mating of heterosexual couples is a sacrosanct relationship. No matter how much parents, siblings, or children may hate one's marriage partner or disapprove of the relationship, the inheritance right of that partner is inviolate, even without a will. Our out-of-the-law relationships are quite another matter. If we want our companion lovers to inherit our estate, we do not have the heterosexual privilege to indulge in any superstition or squeamishness about death or wills. We cannot afford to be lazy or thoughtless either. A legal loophole-free will is a lesbian necessity, one more price we pay for our audacity, for our insistence upon living with and loving women. In addition, we need to name as an executor a friend who can assist our beloved companion to stand up for her inheritance rights, should that become necessary. We cannot give our families the opportunity to behave badly, no matter how sure we are that they really know and accept our lesbianism and our partner. In other words, we must be lesbian cautious to the end. Lesbians need caution in matters concerning our death and our possessions because many of our families have learned to ignore, forget, or shield themselves from the lesbian foundation upon which our quote-unquote friendships are built. Their self-deceit is usually the result of collusion between our families and ourselves, an unspoken agreement that if we do not discuss our personal lives with them, they will treat us as if we did not have personal lives at all. This covert contract enables us to fit into a normal family niche, that of the sexless, unmarried daughter, sister, aunt, who for some reason, after all, she was pretty enough, couldn't get or couldn't keep a husband. So she lives with another woman in similar circumstances. In this way, the family does not have to acknowledge and quote-unquote do something about our lesbianism, and neither do we. When we die and try to leave our estate to our quote-unquote friend, the agreement is broken and our families are left to deal with our lesbianism without our help. It is not surprising that they frequently deal with it badly. I am convinced that we lesbians and gay men would be better off if we gave our families the opportunity to adjust to our lives while we are living them. Those family members who cannot adjust with love can adjust with politeness. If they can do neither, we can create families of choice from among the large and varied communities of lesbians and gay men. Certainly, heterosexuals expect their families to adjust to their choices. Heterosexuals do not respect their families' feelings about their love choices when those are racist, anti-Semitic, or classist. For example, the way we respect our families' homophobia. Heterosexuals marry persons of the wrong race, religion, nationality, class. They marry persons their families think are too old, too young, too stupid, too educated, too lazy, too ill for them. They would not attend a family gathering at which an unacceptable wife or husband was not welcome. They demand their families accept, or at the least tolerate, their choices, and most families do just that. Lesbians and gay men should demand no less for our families than our heterosexual siblings do. But I love her or him is all the reason heterosexuals think necessary to justify their choices. Why should we need more? And just as the knowledge of their wrong love choices does not cause the premature deaths of their mothers and fathers, neither will the knowledge that our love choice is the wrong sex kill off our folks. Our family's homophobia is a social disease that can be cured by love, patience, education, and the everyday sight of lesbian and gay parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, sisters and brothers, children and grandchildren, nieces and nephews, and their companion lovers living our lives and our deaths out of the closet. The Importance of a Will. Oh God, this is relatable, by Alison Bechdel. Josephine cracks under the pressure of deciding what to wear to meet Miriam's parents. Oh, and they have View from a Gay Head, the song printed here by Alex Dotkin. I'll read a little bit of it. I heard Cheryl and Mary say, there are two kinds of people in the world today, one or the other. A person must be, the men are them, and the women are we. They agree, it's a pleasure to be a lesbian. Lesbian. Let's be in no man's land. Lesbian, lesbian. Any woman can be a lesbian. Liza wishes the library had men and women placed separately. For theirs is the kingdom. She knows what she'll find, or she knows who she'll find, in the history of mankind. But then she's inclined to be ahead of her time. She's a lesbian. Lesbian. Let's be in no man's land. Lesbian, lesbian. Any woman can be a lesbian. Carol is tired of being nice with a sweet smile and a pretty face, submissive device to pacify the people, for they won't defend a woman who's indifferent to men. She's my friend, she's a lesbian, and women's anger, Louise explains, a million second places in the master's game. It's real as a mountain, it's strong as the sea. Besides, an angry woman is a beauty. She's chosen to be a dyke like me. She's a lesbian. Lesbian. Lesbian, no man's land. Let's be in no man's land, right? Lesbian. Lesbian. Any woman can be a lesbian. The sexes do battle and batter about. The men's are the sexes I will live without. I'll return to the bosom where my journey ends, where there's no penis between us friends. Will I see you again when you're a lesbian? Lesbian. Let's be in no man's land. Lesbian, lesbian. Any woman can be a lesbian. Ah, so gorgeous. Elizabethan drama. Oof. Crooked and straight in academia. I'm sorry, I'm like reading this. This is like a play that they wrote, but Susan Wolfe's initials are SJW, and it's actually like I can't read it. Oh, they have Where Will You Be by Pat Parker here, which yeah, we read that recently. Let's read this. Post Scribbles by Joanna Russ. 1. Overheard at a gay conference, lesbian to gay man, nearby a woman minister in minister suit, trying not to smile. We're all in drag. A common way to cloak one's hatred and one's dismissal of an issue is to snot it, as in the outraged ignorance of the reviews of March Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time, and the more sophisticated and more hateful reviews of Adrienne Rich's Of Woman Born. 3. The paralysis of the open secret, everyone reassured about their generosity and your safety, except you. Or the even worse open secret, which everybody knows except you, a closet so vanishingly small that it's collapsed into a one-dimensional point and extruded itself possibly into some other universe where it may be of use, but not in this one. A well-meaning woman friend, upon learning that I was a lesbian. That's all right. It's nobody's business but yours. 4. Some white male reviewer in the New York Times speaking slightingly of the irredentism of the minority groups in our time. The boys never cease to amaze me. 5. That isn't an issue. That isn't an issue anymore. That isn't really an issue anymore. Therefore, why do you keep bringing it up? You keep bringing it up because you are crazy. You keep bringing it up because you are destructive. You keep bringing it up because you want to be annoying. You keep bringing it up because you are greedy and selfish. You keep bringing it up because you are full of hate. You keep bringing it up because you want to flaunt yourself. You keep bringing it up because you are deliberately want to separate yourself from the rest of the community. How do you expect me to support a person as crazy, destructive, annoying, selfish, hateful, flaunting, separatist as you are? I really cannot support someone as bad as that, especially since there is no really important issue involved. 6. Vaginas do not have sharp little teeth. Pass it on. And then in asterisks, she put here, Italian radicalism of the later 19th century calling for a unification of all the Italian-speaking peoples, as in nationalism, by extension, fighting for the rights of a group which perceives itself to have some common interest. How wicked. Bye, Naomi. I know, this is a great piece for today. I mean, lesbians deal with the same shit. Louisa May Incest, a one-act play for two women by Carolyn Gage. I'm not going to read any of the plays. I'm sorry. I'm not. I hate acting out. This is a beautiful Amazon drawing by Sudi Rakusin. Got a Labrys and a big-ass candle. It's a poem by Judy Gran, Carol in the Park Chewing on Straws. I don't know the actual name of this poem. She has taken a woman lover, whatever shall we do? She has taken a woman lover, how lucky it wasn't you. And all the day through the smiles and lies, and grits her teeth and pretends to be shy, or weak, or busy. Then she goes home and pounds her own nails, makes her own bets, and fixes her own car with her friend. She goes as far as women can go without protection from men. On weekends, she dreams of becoming a tree that dreams it is ground up and sent to the paper factory, where it lies helpless in sheets until it dreams of becoming a paper airplane and rises on its own current, where it turns into a bird, a coasting bird that dreams of becoming more free, even than that, a feather, finally, or a piece of air with lightning in it. She has taken a woman lover. Whatever can we say? She walks around all day, quietly, but underneath it, she's electric, angry energy inside a passive form, the common woman as common as a thunderstorm. From Edward the Dyke. Lesbian Metaphysics by Janet Alfs. Of all the holes I've jumped in the air, being a dyke is the holiest. Look, even my tracks have no edges. I leap, spin, around once, both feet off the ground. Bright sun everywhere, and below. My body, no shadow. How different, I think. Even talented to leave. No trace, but practical. Who will wonder where I am? Who will muse about me if they never knew I was here? I keep jumping holes in the air, sometimes as a meteor, falls through the one and burns a crater in the earth. I did that, I think, to myself, pointing. Lesbian invisibility. ASWAC, Alberta Status of Women Action Committee meeting. I don't see any lesbians. Quite funny. On My Way by Christos to Washington, D.C. to speak for lesbian rights. It all started when I agreed to lecture 200 students at the university on anti-racism. I did well enough, though I was at the bottom of a bowl of seats with a few scattered notes and a weariness with a subject deep enough to scream. There was the usual white guy saying he agreed with everything I said, who couldn't go on when I asked him if he realized how patronizing it sounded for him to say that, and the usual white gal on the verge of hysteria who accused me of making him uncomfortable and claimed that reverse racism is real, because 12 black girls in her high school beat her up once, and the usual students of color relieved to hear me or anybody then speaking eloquently of their own experiences. There was the usual applause, tears of those I had touched. Then a woman came up very close to me. I thought she was a dyke, and she said, "I'm a white person, as you can see. Why do they always think they have to tell us that? And when things go wrong, it's always my fault. I want to know why are we always you people, can't see this is your fault?" She started to tell me that we didn't have to live as we do, and as usual, little bits of steam started around my ears, and then she said, "Are you a lesbian?" "Yes," I said. "You're sick," she said with the usual venom. My arm went back, fury, sudden hot, and in front of the departing students' ice cream, "I am not sick. Get out of my face." Oh, she was happy then to see me being the savage she knew I was, and how ashamed, as usual, I was that she could get me in the throat, touch my last raw nerve, and blow up my heart. I hurried away. She chased after me to tell me 2 more times at the top of her lungs that I was sick. I shouted at her again in the halls, my fist still clenched, her rage all that stopped me. "Respect your elders," I hear my father murmur. She taunts me again. "You'll go to the penitentiary if you hit me." Quite proud of herself. I shouted back, "That's the only reason I haven't." A native student with tears in her eyes held me. Some black women encouraged me. Some white women thanked me. I had a plane to catch. All the way to the airport, all the way to D.C., all the time I was in D.C. My heart raced. I held in tears as well as I could, as usual. That old woman would tell you this grief and rage are all my own fault, that she didn't ruin my elation at going to D.C. with thousands and thousands of other lesbians, that it's my own fault I'm the poor queer and unhappy with America. She'd tell you that just as she thought I'm a savage and we're all sick. Will you shout it with me now? We are not sick. Again, we are not sick. To the Women Who Weep by Kaya Zablocki Heller. They say we are crazy, we women who weep, who keep the last grains of soil moist with our grief. They say we are crazy, for we do not string coins upon a cord and then eat them instead. We set clay bowls beneath the moon's face and sit and dream over her reflection. They say we are crazy, that we long for a past we've invented, that we long for a time when women stroke the earth with magic feet, and when women ruled gently like grandmothers. But we are not crazy. Our madness makes us bold and sane. Our sadness makes us rage. Our sadness and our rage are the last precious stones of our fortune. We need these stones to throw, destroy, rebuild what we know we have lost. We are not as they say. Our tears and our memories fertilize our fields and taste in our mouths like manna. That is from the 36th edition of Sinister Wisdom. Letter to Claudia Brenner in memory of Rebecca White by Janet Alves. Claudia, I don't know you. Can't begin to imagine what it was like to kneel beside your lover as breath and blood drained out of her body into the flattened ferns. He aimed to kill you both, but you lived. Against his will. As long as you live, you won't forget the day that began like any other. Darts of light aimed through the leaves fell prism-like into your tent. Your curled bodies pulled up from deep breathing. Dreams to drink breaths of pine. You opened your eyes, alive in the silence, nobody to interrupt the tremors that began in your sleep-warm bellies, like warnings. They spread with certain aim up your spines to your tongues aimed into each other's mouths. You breathed aspects of aspen and birch, cloud-like shadows on the nylon roof. Life slowed down to where each began to feel the earth's rotation in her body. The triumph of women's bodies spiraling together, aiming for home. The killer, unknown, had begun to stalk you by then, his breath heavy from the climb, the plant life around him vibrating green-like. It had always been that bright, like the heat of your twined bodies could burn him alive, so that even after he hit what he had aimed for, he kept firing, breathing hard. Claudia, I don't know you, can't begin to imagine how likely it is for a man to aim his gun at a woman's body and shoot the breath out, or where in the life he shattered, you begin. Ooh, fuck. I'm Not a Girl by Judy Graham. I'm not a girl, I'm a hatchet. I'm not a hole, I'm a whole mountain. I'm not a fool, I'm a survivor. I'm not a pearl, I'm the Atlantic Ocean. I'm not a good lay, I'm a straight razor. Look at me as if you've never seen a woman before. I have red hands and much bitterness. Words by Susan Sherman. I am trapped by words, the ones I speak, the ones I never say. My head's stuffed full of dreams, my body of memories. I flounder between two worlds, the future and the past. I wanted to write a poem more full of passion, more full of love than any I have ever written. How does one measure years? What standard does one use to weight them? I am trapped by time. It circles my wrists, guides my steps. I live in the shadow of my words. They measure the moments of my life. What part in all of this do you have? What part in all this do I to understand that question, to hold it open, until finding it, we enter free. You don't wanna eat pussy by Christos. That Chippewa said to that gay white man who never has, you don't want to eat pussy after eating hot peppers, he laughed. I stared in the white sink, memorizing rust stains. He nodded in the general direction of the windows behind us, two native women chopping onions and pickles to make tuna fish sandwiches for these 6 men helping to move. He said, you didn't hear that, did ya? Good, she answered. I chose to ignore it. I muttered, so did I. You don't want to take offense at an Indian man's joke, no matter how crude, in front of a white man. Close to my tribe, he probably guessed we're lesbians. Said that to see what we'd do, which was to keep on doing what we had been doing. The gay white man stopped talking about how much he loved hot peppers. Oh, God. That Chippewa said, not too much for me. Don't eat fish. Probably another joke we ignored, I said. The grocery was fresh out of buffalo and deer. Much later, that gay white man called that Chippewa a drunk. We both stared at a different floor, in a different silence, just as sharp and hot. Dicks of America. Now we know where they are coming from. Wow. From the, this is a cute little P.O. Box 00782. And this is their number in case you need to contact Dicks of America. How Can You Tell a Dyke by Donna Allegra. If she tells men no, won't suck his dick or ego, doesn't go giggly when he insults, is not intimidated when he menaces, won't stand for disrespect, has her own attitude and opinion about everything, insists on being listened to when it's her turn, decides her own way is just fine, if she likes women, cares about them, prefers their company to his, can't see the fun of having a man around the house to mess it up and pick up after. If he can't coerce his way into her bed by insinuating, can't threaten himself between her legs by calling her one, doesn't act like a dick-happy simple bitch, decides heterosex isn't so great as it cracked up to be, if she doesn't really give a fuck what some boy thinks about her or anything else, doesn't like most men, feels no woman in her right mind would you look at how they act and even halfway think about, if she goes out with you, assumes you wanted the pleasure of her company, doesn't give a hoot or holler how much reefer, alcohol, cocaine money he offers, doesn't give good head, or any for that matter. If she by her lights examines his, calls her own shots, just won't listen to what a man has to say, and he can't tell her anything anymore. This is cute too. This is by Jennifer Camper. Gay, queer, gay, queer, gay, queer, gay, 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 queer, queer, queer. Mock, so she bangs their heads together. Dyke. First National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights, 1979. And this is another comic. How am I supposed to sit here and draw cartoons when there's a straight white guy running the country? Yeah, word, by Diana DiMassa. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. If you haven't read this by Audre Lorde, you should. Six pomegranate seeds and one lesson in manners, a piece about straight folks who don't mind gays, but by Eliot. Current events. Zsa Zsa Gabor says receiving a jail term would endanger her because of the lesbians in prisons, and I say, relax, babes. We bulldykes tend to avoid those who so openly hate women. On the joys of a familiar. I saw Flossie's new trick today. When Toot, treat in hand, asked Flossie, would you rather be straight or dead? The dog hit the ground, legs stiff in the air, as we made jokes that were hardly polite. Heteropatriarchy, sweet heteropatriarchy. Thrust, thrust, thrust might sound like sex to you, but yours is not the only physical reality. Bulldyke Humor 1, Heterosex. When I met Jackie, her t-shirt said, lesbianism is the only natural form of birth control. I have said that to doctors when they ask me if I'm on birth control. Bulldyke Humor 2, Art. Others' postcard this week is a picture of Ayers Rock, Australia, with the slogan, Smooth, designed with a woman in mind, cut from some ad and pasted on. One current plot of the International Lesbian Conspiracy is to gather our climbers and artists and a couple tons of clay and construct huge nipple up there. During twilight, of course, we'd sign it, Love the Leaping Lesbians. And speaking of art, tell me, breeder boys, why are words about your life real poetry and words about mine just politics? Pat Parker's politeness model. I spent lunch dreaming of the mystical Sue and her gracious gang, but perhaps you don't know the Ladies' Sewing Circle and Terrorist Society. Perhaps you should, or perhaps now you do. From the Separatist Revolution, 1991. More ways to wear out your welcome. The Chosen Family. I don't understand you girls. I don't have pictures of naked men all over my house. I see. 2 by Cheryl Clark. The woman who raised me asks me, where is the hope here? Where is the hope? The fruit here is rotten, and the roots are excavated. The sidewalks are cracked and in pieces, and the rain forms stagnant pools. Children walk the night through the streets here, and men make every urge so public. And who will hear me cry for help? Will they want to climb all these flights up here to save me? And what will you do when you wake up and find your good woman gone? She Ain't Heavy, She's My Sister. This is from The Chosen Family by Noreen Stevens. What's the matter, Bun? In 3 days, we've taken Wendy to Lavender Moonscape for drinks, to Women's Beach. We rented Desert Hearts. Remember this part at the theater? 3-story breasts. We played Farron. We've not used leaves to wipe our ass. We dropped in on Jasmine and Sarah's party, and she tripped over 2 necking women. I think she's overwhelmed. Hey, Wendy, what's that? Oh, this? A picture of Joe and me and the kids. Don't touch it. Will Wendy ever recover from her bout of lesbian overload? You decide. Oh, this is another lovely piece by Sudie Rakusin. Another Amazon depiction. Wow, what is this? In sex work, Joan Nessel has contributed a piece called Lesbians and Prostitutes, a historical sisterhood, she says. Besides recognizing the history of prostitutes as a valuable source for lesbian history, another connection that emerges is the lesbian customer and protector of prostitutes. She illustrates this with the wonderful and moving story of Jean Benet, who is a transvestite and a John, who winds up deciding to enlist some of the women she visited in her all-women's gang. Blanche Pinot, won away from her pimp by Benet, is shot and killed by him in their bedroom. The year is 1876. Nestle adds later, lesbians have and still do turn to prostitutes for sexual comfort as well as work as prostitutes themselves. Nestle attempts to draw connections between prostitutes and lesbians, but she has no radical analysis of the condition of women, lesbians, or prostitutes. There are connections between lesbians and prostitutes. I know because I am one, a lesbian, an ex-prostitute. I have lived the connection. I still live daily with the results. I have been a lesbian for about 30 years, coming out butch. Transvestite, actually, as a young teenager in the 1950s, meant that I couldn't finish school, couldn't get a regular job, couldn't rent a place to live after home became unbearable. The irony of loving women, which created a situation for me, actually created by an ageist, classist, and sexist society, whereby the alternative to jail and the street was the street, jail and fucking men for a meal, small change and a temporary bed, is only surpassed by the damage. Consider the fact that I learned what sexuality meant from Johns and pimps before I could find what it might mean with a girl I loved. This lesson is not erasable. My body remembers all of it. It seems that bodies learn. It is in the body physically how sex is to be felt, not just done or gone through. I submit to my readers that it was not a good thing for this girl child, this young lesbian, to do with her bright fired self. The man's lie, strategy, and damage. The removing of oneself from one's body is a strategy for immediate survival. Many prostitutes acknowledge this. This numbing, whether done like other torture victims do it, with drugs and alcohol, is flight from that which is intolerable. Numbing mechanisms become reflex quickly. Reversing the process later or in other circumstances is difficult. It is my belief that such numbing in sexual assault situations sets women up for tolerating abuse, especially prostitution and sadomasochism. Although I use this strategy as often as not, I also used a more damaging one at the same time. Today I call this second strategy the man's lie, but then I called it pro-sex and my choice. The man's lie is still passing as truth, not only from the man, but also through the lips of women who, like I did, believe the lie. I mean, when Scarlet Harlot quotes her friend Priscilla Alexander as saying, the right to be a prostitute is as important as the right not to be one, it is the right to set the terms of one's own sexuality. What I hear is that someone thinks that prostitution has something to do with women owning our own bodies, somehow, while at the same time selling the very same bodies to men who hate women, whores and lesbians, and who do not make any excuse for their hatred. This mindfuck is very familiar to me. I thought for the longest time that I had invented it. I double-fucked myself for years before coming face to face with the truth of how male supremacist sexuality got to me. Not just remembering, but feeling, not just looking at all of it momentarily, but living it. Not just opened up, but analyzed from a radical feminist politic for what it is and does. I have not always been a feminist, but I have always wanted to be free and female. What I did in my mind did have something to do with freedom. When I spoke the man's lie silently to myself about prostitution, I felt closer to freedom. When I told myself that I chose what happened, even the rapes, that I felt okay about what was done to my body, even against my will, that the sex in the room had something to do with me and my sexuality, even though when she was in the room too, my lover, the only thing I tried to do was keep him interested in me so he wouldn't fuck her. Some butch role. That the nausea, alienated, bruises, humiliation, STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, poverty, abortion, all were somehow fixable with what amounts to an EST positive attitude. Oppressed people develop a sixth sense when we anticipate the next move of our enemy in order to try to be successfully out of the way or in the most acceptable pose. The EST positive attitude served that purpose, as well as twisting my own mind. That is, the man's lie not only took the truth away from me, but it also served the man by allowing him to point at me and say, see, she loves it, she chose it, she's even a lesbian, they all want it, women are whores by nature. Sexual inequality. Dominance and submission is the basic dynamic of sexuality. Regard for an equal is not sexy. Hierarchy is sexy. Power is sexy. Vulnerability is sexy. Humiliation is a sexual practice. It is humiliating to be a second-class citizen. That's why men keep women second-class. Men as a class devise male supremacy because men, but not only men, find it exciting to use force and coercion. The good news is this isn't biological. This dynamic is best expressed through prostitution. Ruling class men buying women to feel their power manifested. Working class men, middle class men, men of all races and ages, disabled men and gay men are also to be counted as Johns when I start counting. Name your category and I'll tell you what he looked like. It is felt in bodies as sexual, this expression of power. It is a sexual rush just to contemplate it. Ever watch some upscale man thumb through a Vogue magazine? He consumes it like other men do, actual pornography. Watch the body language. Whores are good at noticing men's body language. I watch them openly. It disturbs them to be watched. I know that some gay men do not flinch from fucking women or lesbians. My own experience stands. Some of my Johns were gay men who just thought I was a young teenage boy churning tricks for spending money. Blowjobs reveal nothing in terms of biology, and I consistently passed for a straight boy when I chose to. But some of them knew I was a lesbian and thought it was cute to buy a gay sister. Someone once asked me why it was that gay men seem to have a stake in female prostitution. I think I know. Our gay brothers directly profit from keeping all women down, and prostitution is central to keeping women down as a class. Some gay men sometimes use women that way too. It's very interesting stuff. Without dominance and submission, sexual boredom sets in. My guess about why many lesbian couples who stay together over time seem to coast to a dead stop sexually, or at least turn to a slow bell, is that familiarity breeds a working knowledge of the other person, while commonality creates a rough-cut version of respect. That is, the more we like each other, and the more actual respect we have, the less dominance and submission is left, and therefore sexual feelings are not aroused as easily. Even built-in hierarchies like class, race, disability sometimes soften over time. Heterosexual hierarchy is much less likely to soften because male and female are terms defined by the dynamic of dominance and submission. It is categorically defined as sexual hierarchy, where other hierarchies are not seen immediately as necessarily sexual. They are, but it requires some analysis to get there from here. Example, pornography shows us that Black women are used in specific ways to make their skin into a sexual organ, to be then violated like genitals. We didn't find much visible bruising on Black women's bodies in pornography. I want to ask my community, when we have sexual feelings, what are we feeling? Is it the pleasure and danger, perhaps? Have we eroticized our own destruction? As in the story of O by Pauline Rieg, do we, like O, stands for nothing, murder ourselves? I wonder what there is left for me. I wonder where I am, or do we, like Pat Califia, San Francisco's picture-perfect lesbian, quote-unquote sadist, who left town after allegedly carving into an unwanted swastika into a working-class dyke's body. I know the Jewish nurse who had to clean the wound, and who couldn't figure out how to reach orgasm with a woman lover, turn 180 degrees from sexual dysfunction into a sadist who would rather fuck a hot male masochist than a vanilla lesbian. It seems to me that what might have been Califia's original problem is simply that two women, without more, don't generate enough dominance and submission for her arousal. The sexual dynamic of hierarchy was missing. I think that perhaps more women than Califia might feel this way. Maybe sadomasochism has been the key to inventing arousal, so that orgasm is possible for some lesbians. I know that butch femme roles work that way even when mixed and matched, kiki in 50s language. I know that many, if not all, of my women lovers were aroused by what they perceived to be my butch ways. The difference between Califia and myself is only a matter of degree, not content. Sexual hierarchy is sexy. This is why I think that many lesbians have embraced sadomasochism and other trappings of male supremacist sexuality, such as pornography, prostitution, strip shows, etc., as a newly found, previously denied to be explored sexuality that we need to adopt, adapt, whitewash, and call our own. I also think that some lesbians learned their sadomasochism directly from gay men, as well as from prostitutes, ex-prostitutes, and pornography. Prostitutes have been known to express our utter contempt for the Johns that use us, but usually only to each other. We do not correct the power imbalance when we do this, although it does feel briefly better to vent the outrage and disgust. This is one way to acknowledge the abuse of our bodies while attempting to block the fact that we are second-class citizens being used for what women are, sex. The bravado about having power over men because men buy us is simply bullshit. When those who dominate you get to take the initiative in your own human destruction, you have lost more than any oppressed people yet has ever gotten back. The prostitute who performs as a female sadist, a dominatrix, does not reverse the dynamic of dominance and submission. It may be true that she has complete power over the male masochist body for those moments that she is paid to do what she is told to do by him, but I think that is a matter of this man wanting to violate the social taboo against men giving up male power. It is also true that the power of male supremacy is so great that a man can feel very safe even while he chooses to toy with submission momentarily. Let me suggest to you that if dominatrix used that power she has during this singular moment in history in the way that men use their power over women, she'd either be in jail or dead. It is phony power. I'm going to skip ahead here. Sisterhood, just another brotherhood. Now, what about lesbians buying women, prostitutes, other lesbians for sex? Like men, it isn't news. Lesbian pimps have always been around. Lesbian prostitutes have always been around. Lesbian Johns have always been around. I've known some of them. What has not been challenged is the harm done to those women who are positioned to be bought and sold. It is the failure of feminism to leave the structure of male supremacy intact while women pry their way into it. It is outrageous to me that women attorneys who call themselves feminists who don't have to sell themselves to men for $15 a blowjob say, I think that prostitution is an excellent way to earn a living. Flo Kennedy, attorney, activist, TV interviewer, Miss Magazine, July 1987. I didn't know Flo Kennedy had said anything like that, so that's interesting to me. Kennedy is just the most recent example. Attorney Nan Hunter, who wrote the fact brief against the Dworkin-McKinnon anti-pornography civil rights ordinance, said in it, a range of feminist imagination and expression in the realm of sexuality has barely begun to find voice. Women need the freedom and socially recognized space to appropriate for themselves the robustness of what traditionally has been male language. Who wrote this? This is by Susan Stinson. So, yeah, quite interesting. Very interesting stuff in here. Tremors. Your head is on my shoulder while somewhere the earth shifts. Feminism produces a rage, creates it, feeds it, watches it grow. We attempt to make of this a strength. As I was raped, I am a survivor. This is an act of endurance, but confronting the evidence of our powerlessness does not equate with power. We have been raped, nearly all of us. We have, every one of us, been robbed. With what stubbornness do women robbed of our lives continue to live? Many men are islands, don't believe the saying, but no woman is separate from womankind. The bond of sister, mother, daughter, lover, friend is reality, is community, is. Even the sellout is the comfort of her counterfeit success, has not beaten us, does not truly hasten our demise, despite our fears to the contrary. For to live unconnected to woman is only a hollow denial of our bond. The contrast is unbearable. Your head is cradled on my shoulder. The newspaper says a woman, young, was raped and beaten by 6 men. Her life stretches before her now, an unbroken series of days to relive, remember, vomit her fear. But her hatred, she will be told, is an unacceptable response to theirs. Terror of living alone, or on a ground floor, or in the country, of being alone on a city street or in a park, or getting into her car, or into an elevator, of dancing, studying, sleeping, or waking. This is called the survival of rape. Her life is before her, so many mornings and nights ice-starred with memory of this active imbalance, proof to them of her powerlessness in their world. This theft of her power, her freedom, this woman robbed of her life. And when she knows it all, the balance must change, the scales alter. You stir and settle again more restfully, your head secure on my shoulder. We are at rest, we are in balance. But somewhere always the earth shifts. Lesbian quote-unquote sex by Marilyn Fry. The reasons the word sex is in quotation marks in my title are two. One is that the term is an inappropriate term for what lesbians do, and the other is that whatever it is that lesbians do, for lack of a better word, might be called sex, we apparently do so damned little of it. For a great many lesbians, the gap between the high hopes we had some time ago for lesbian sex and the way things have turned out has turned the phrase lesbian sex into something of a bitter joke. I don't want to exaggerate this. Things aren't so bad for all lesbians or all of the time. But in our communities as a whole, there is much grumbling on the subject. It seems worthwhile to explore some of the meanings of the relative dearth of what, for lack of a better word, we call lesbian sex. Recent discussions of lesbian sex frequently cite the finding of a study on couples by Blumstein and Schwartz, which is perceived by most of us who discussed it as having been done well, with a good sample of couples, lesbian, male homosexual, heterosexual, non-married, and heterosexual married couples. These people apparently found that lesbian couples have sex far less frequently than any other type of couple, that lesbian couples are less sexual as couples and as individuals than anyone else. In their sample, only about 1/3 of lesbians in relationships of 2 years or longer had sex once a week or more. 47% of lesbians in long-term relationships had sex once a month or less. While married heterosexual couples, only 15% had sex once a month or less, and they report that lesbians seem to be more limited in the range of their sexual techniques than other couples. When this sort of information first came into my circle of lesbian friends, we tended to see it as confirming to what we know from our own experience. But on reflection, looking again at what has been going on with us in our long-term relationships, the nice fit between this report and our experience seems not so perfect after all. It was brought to our attention during our ruminations on this that what 85% of long-term heterosexual married couples do more than once a month takes on average 8 minutes to do. Although in my experience, lesbians discuss their sex lives with each other relatively little, a point to which I will return, I know from my own experience and from the reports of a few other lesbians in long-term relationships that what we do that on average we do considerably less frequently takes on average considerably more than 8 minutes to do. It takes about 30 minutes at the least, sometimes maybe an hour, and it is not uncommon that among these relatively uncommon occurrences, an entire afternoon or evening is given over to activities organized around doing it. The suspicion arises that what 85% of heterosexual married couples are doing more than once a month, and what 47% of lesbian couples are doing less than once a month is not the same thing. I remember that one of my first delicious tastes of old gay lesbian culture occurred in a bar where I was getting acquainted with some new friends. One was talking about being busted out of the Marines for being gay. She had been put under suspicion somehow and was sent off to the base psychiatrist to be questioned, her perverted tendencies to be assessed. He wanted to convince her she had only been engaged in a little youthful experimentation and wasn't really gay. To this end, he questioned her about the extent of her sexual experiences. What he asked was, "How many times have you had sex with a woman?" At this, we all laughed and giggled. What an ignorant fool. What does he think he means? Times. What will we count? What's to count? Another of my friends, years later discussing the same conundrum, said that she thought that maybe every time you got up to go to the bathroom, that marked a time. The joke about how many times is still good for a chuckle from time to time in my life with my lover. I have no memory of such a topic providing any such merriment in my years of sexual encounters and relationships with men. It would have been very rare indeed that we would not have known how to answer the question, "How many times did you do it?" If what heterosexual married couples do that individuals report under the rubric sex or have sexual relations is something that in most instances can easily be individuated into countable instances, this is more evidence that it is not what long-term lesbian couples do, or for that matter, what short-term lesbian couples do. What violence did the lesbians do to their experience by answering the same question the heterosexuals answered, as though it had the same meaning for them? How did the lesbians figure out how to answer the questions? How frequently? How many times? My guess is that different individuals figured it out differently. Some might have counted a 2 or 3 cycle evening as one time they had sex. Some might have counted it as 2 or 3 times. Some may have counted as times only the times both partners had orgasms. Some may have counted as times occasions on which at least one had an orgasm. Those who did not have orgasms or have them far more rarely than they have sex may not have figured orgasms into the calculations. Perhaps some counted as a time every episode in which both touched each other's vulva more than fleetingly and not for something like a health examination. For some, to count every reciprocal touch of the vulva would have made them counting as having sex more than most people with a job or a work would dream of having time for. How do we suppose those individuals counted times? Is there any good reason why they should not count all those as times? Does it depend on how fulfilling it was? Was anybody else counting by occasions of fulfillment? We have no idea how the individual lesbians surveyed were counting their sexual acts, but this also raises the questions of how heterosexuals counted their sexual acts. By orgasms? By whose orgasms? If the havings of sex by heterosexual married couples did take on the average 8 minutes, my guess is that a very large number of those cases the woman did not experience orgasms. My guess is that neither the woman's pleasure nor the woman's orgasms were pertinent in the most of the individuals counting and reporting the frequency with which they had sex. So do lesbian couples really have sex any less frequently than heterosexual couples? I'd say that lesbian couples have sex a great deal less frequently than heterosexual couples by the criteria that I'm betting most of the heterosexual people use to count times. Lesbians don't have sex at all. No male orgasms, no times. I'm willing to draw the conclusion that heterosexual women don't have sex either, that what they report is the frequency with which their partners had sex. It has been said before by feminists that the concept of having sex is a phallic concept, that it pertains to heterosexual intercourse, in fact, primarily to heterosexist intercourse, i.e., male-dominant, female-subordinate copulation, whose completion and purpose is the male's ejaculation. I have thought this was true since the first time the idea was put to me some 12 years ago. But I have been finding lately that I have to go back over some of the ground I covered a decade ago because some of what I knew then I knew too superficially. For some of us, myself included, the move from heterosexual relating to lesbian relating was occasioned or speeded up or brought to closure by our knowledge that what we had done under the heading having sex was indeed male-dominant, female subordination, copulation, whose completion, etc. And it was not worthy of doing. Yet now, years later, we are willing to ask answer such questionnaires that ask us how frequently we have sex and are dissatisfied with ourselves and with our relationships because we don't quote unquote have sex enough. We are so dissatisfied that we keep a small army of therapists in business trying to help us have sex more. We quit having sex years ago and for excellent and compelling reasons. What exactly is our complaint now? In all these years I have been doing and writing feminist theory, I have not, until very recently, written, much less published, a word about sex. I did not write, though, as it was suggested to me that I do so, anything in the sadomasochistic debates. I left entirely unanswered an invitation to be the keynote speaker at a feminist conference about women's sexuality, which by all reports turned out to be an excellent conference. I was quite unable to think of anything but vague truisms to say, and very few of those. Feminist theory is grounded in experience. I have always written feminist political and philosophical analysis from the bottom up, starting with my own encounters and adventures, frustrations, pain, anger, delight, etc. Sometimes this has no doubt made it a little provincial, but it has at least had the virtue of firm connection with someone's real lived experience, which is more than you can say for a lot of theory. When I put to myself the task of theorizing about sex and sexuality, it was as though I had no experience, as though there was no ground on which and from which to generate theory. But if I understand the terminology rightly, I have in fact been what they call sexually active for close to a quarter of a century, about half of my life, almost all of what they call one's adult life. Heterosexually, lesbianly, and autoerotically. Surely I have experience, but I seem not to have experiential knowledge of the sort I need. Reflecting on all that history, I realize that in many of its passages, this experience has been a muddle, acting, being acted on, choosing, desiring, pleasure and displeasure, all akimbo, not coherently determining and connecting with each other. Even in its greatest intensity, it has for the most part been somehow rather opaque to me, not fully in my grasp. My quote-unquote experience has in general the character more of a buzzing, blooming confusion than of experience. And it has occurred in the midst of almost total silence on the part of others about their experience. The experience of others has for the most part also been opaque to me. They do not discuss or describe it in detail at all. I recall an hours-long and heated argument among some 8 or 10 lesbians at a party a couple of years ago about sadomasochism, whether it is okay or not. When Carolyn and I left, we realized that in the whole time, not one woman had said one concrete, explicit, physiologically specific thing about what she actually did. The one arguing in favor of bondage, did she have her hands tied gently with her ribbons or scarves, or harshly with handcuffs and chains? What other parts of her body were or weren't restrained, and by what means? And what parts of her body were touched, and how while she was bound, and what liberty did she have to touch in return? And if she had no such liberty, was it part of her experience to want that liberty in tension or frustration? Or was it her experience that she felt pleased and satisfied to not have that liberty? Who knows? She never said a single word at this level of specificity. I think I've been here a while. I should probably get off here soon. Nor did anyone else, pro or con. I once perused a large and extensively illustrated book on sexual activity by and for homosexual men. It was astounding to me, for one thing in particularly, namely, that its pages constituted a huge lexicon of words for acts and activities, their subacts, preludes and denouements, their stylistic variation, their sequences. Gay male sex, I realized then, is articulate. It is articulate to a degree that, in my world, lesbian sex does not remotely approach. Lesbian sex, as I have known it, most of the time I have known it, is utterly inarticulate. Most of my lifetime, most of my experience in the realms of commonly designated as sexual has been pre-linguistic, non-cognitive. I have in effect no linguistic community, no language, and therefore, in one important sense, no knowledge. In situations of male dominance, women are for the most part excluded from the formulation and validation of meaning, and thereby denied the means to express themselves. Men's meanings and not women's meanings are encoded in what is presumed to be the whole population's language. In many cases, both the men and women assume it is everyone's language. The meanings one's life and experience might generate cannot come fully into operation if they are not woven into language. They are fleeting or they hover. Vague, not fully coalesced, not connected, and hence not useful for explaining or grounding interpretations, desires, complaints, theories. In response to our understanding that there is something going on in patriarchy that is more or less well described by saying women's meanings are not encoded in the dominant languages, and that this keeps our experience from being fully formed and articulate, we have undertaken quite deliberately to discover, complete, and encode our meanings. Such simple things as naming chivalrous gestures insulting, naming Virginia Woolfe a great writer, naming ourselves women instead of girls or ladies, coining terms like sexism, sexual harassment, and incester. Mary Daly's new book is a whole project of encoding meanings, and we can all find examples of our own more local encodings. Meaning should arise from our bodily self-knowledge, bodily play, tactile communication, the ebb and flow of intense excitement, arousal, tension, release, comfort, discomfort, pain, and pleasure. And I make no distinctions here among bodily, emotional, intellectual, aesthetic. But such potential meanings are more amorphous, less coalesced into discrete elements of a coherent pattern of meanings of an experience than any other dimensions of our lives. In fact, there are for many of us virtually no meanings in this realm because nothing of it is crystallized into a linguistic matrix. I'm going to stop reading this piece now, but very interesting. Cover for the first edition of The Lesbian Path by Margaret Cruikshank, 1980. Photo by T. Corrine. And this is a lovely shot of a labrys over some crocheted lace. Very nice. On Singing Women's Praises by Carolyn Gage. Yes, it's true, I only know one song, but that one song takes all the notes and lasts forever. Another one of Alex Dobkin's songs here. New Ground. Posters of Power. I really love this one. In this place, lesbians come first. Wouldn't that be nice? Poem of Affirmation by Eliot. I am a fat, offensive, man-hating, bitchy witch of a dyke, and I am not alone. Self-Portrait, Seeing Myself Through Alice Walker's Eyes by Jean Weisinger. And then it follows some writing by her. Two Women by Miriam Fougere. This is not a poem for women drinking Diet Colas just to save those extra calories. Dyke Trilogy by T. Corain. This is a very well-known photo. Love poem by Audre Lorde. Speak, earth, and bless me with what is richest. Make sky flow honey out of my hips. Rigid as mountains spread over a valley, carved out by the mouth of rain. And I knew when I entered her I was high. Wind in her forests hollow. Fingers whispering sound, honey flowed from the split cup. Impaled on a lance of tongues, on the tips of her breasts, on her navel, and my breath, howling into her entrances, through lungs of pain. Greedy as herring gulls, or a child, I swing out over the earth, over and over again. And here is a photo of Audre Lorde. I have another poem by her. I dream of a place between your breasts to build my house like a heaven where I plant crops in your body, an endless harvest where the commonest rock is moonstone, and ebony opal, giving milk to all of my hungers, and your night comes down upon me like a nurturing rain. Cover of Sinister Wisdom 3, Spring 1977. There's still much of this book. I'm about halfway through at this point. I've been on for almost 3 hours. Dyke's Kissing by T. Corain. Funnily enough, the close-up shot of this image was used as the album art for my favorite band's debut album, which is Suede. And interestingly enough, they were asked about it, like, what if somebody found, your cover offensive? And it's a band of dudes, right? And I don't remember who from the band, but they were like, anybody who's offended by 2 women kissing in 1993 is a moron, or something to that effect. So that was nice. It's a very beautiful image. And it has been in my life a long time. Sculptures by Miriam Fougere. And then this is an image of this artist actually taking footage of lesbians at a lesbian festival. There's a little kiss mark on her cheek. Somebody must have been wearing some slave paint. A Visionary Woman Creating Visions, Barbara Hammer, by Ellen Myers and Tony Armstrong Jr. Being a lesbian and being an artist is always creating and always defining. It never reaches a static point. Controversy is healthy, especially if it is open. We need to critique one another's work, but before we can do that, we must state our aesthetic. Oh my god, I can't seem to... Yeah, there we go. It's a piece on Black lesbian filmmakers by Cheryl Miller, Michelle Parkerson, Yvonne Weldon, Cheryl Dunye. Lesbian movies I'd like to see. This sounds funny. Teenage militant ninja lesbos. Reptilian dykes are cool to the touch, but never slimy in their politics. Grim Les 2, The New Bitch. A gruesome tale of a really small and mean-hearted lesbian trolls. Hard to believe, of little redeeming value. Postcards from the Edge. Memories of a traveling poets collective and their talking lavender van. Kind of strange, but has its touching moments. Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Sea Work. Nimoy and Shatner have been reduced to silicone statues in a futuristic museum of man. No one has time to rescue them, as every lesbian possible is jetting among the stars, liberating other female aliens from the fear of intimacy and internalized homophobia. Look for a clever use of the calibrated G-spot finder near the end. Fried Lesbo Tomatoes. The title sounds like Damon Runyon's idea of lesbians on drugs, but not so. A feisty old lesbian recently escaped from a nasty nursing home helps a bedraggled but adorable homemaker find love and joy in the arms of another woman. This is accomplished amusingly through stories of radical rural activist lesbians. Pretty Womb Moons. Romantic separatists are beautiful and witchy in this comedy of class differences and love. Dykelet. Shakespeare's eternal dilemma. To be one or not be one. The Princess of Dykes. A Dutch lesbian stomps through her childhood memories for the key that will save her sensitive sister from a painful case of writer's block. Hint, it has something to do with holding back the oceans, leaks, and fingers used in an unusual way. Dykeliners. Exciting film about women medical students daring each other to compete for the longest time doing cunnilingus without coming up for air. The Dyke That Rocks the Cradle. An indictment against the lesbian baby boom of recent years. An innocent-looking baby dyke, acting as nanny, is suspected of attempting to single-handedly curtail the patriarchal breeder's syndrome. Free Dyke City. A separatist dream of the future, a woman-only city patrolled by lesbian rock stars. Carol McDonald, Helen Hook, Toshi Reagan, and the women of Betty and Musica Femina are the intense bounty hunters who relentlessly chase down Richard Gere, the weird intruder. The grossest part is the scene where he claims to be a lesbian. Ew, no way! Les Better Blues. African American dykes into sex, jazz, trombones, and the value of commitment. At play in the fields of the Lesbos, two mercenary white boys crash land in the jungle amid an Amazon tribe. Big personalities clash dramatically as the women decide how to get rid of these intruders and save the rainforests. Nuns on the Run. Several religious women have desires for the aloof Mother Superior in a Montreal cloister. Not Without My Girlfriend. Two Iranian women struggle to escape the binds of patriarchy and tradition to come to America as a couple. Attack of the 50-Foot Lesbian. A science fiction classic monster humorous in her proclivity to bite off the heads of pig-like men. But hey guys, it's just a feminist movie. Don't you have any sense of humor? Oh, I've seen this one before. Don't worry, honey. It's gonna be all right. My therapist says I love you. A nice piece from Dykes to Watch Out For. It says bitch and femme. Curious little terms, aren't they? Or no, it's butch and femme. God. Curious little terms, aren't they? Some women are disdainful of them. Ew, yuck, role-playing, we're above all that. Some women have made them into a science. No, Janet is definitely your typical butchy femme. But no matter how politically correct you are, there are all these roles lurking about, just waiting to ensnare the unsuspecting victim. It's called a skirt. I find it comfortable, okay? Could you try this? Why, sure, darling. I'm trying to open up a can. Maybe you try to fight them. This is why I never sit in your lap. Maybe you sort of get into them. Ooh, you're so strong. But the true glory of the lesbian experience is revealed by our thrilling and extraordinary versatility in times of crisis. I can't believe your mother never taught you this. Eek, don't let it get on my beer can collection. And it's a bat. So cute. Okay. And this dyke is wearing a little nightgown. Oh, lesbian confidentiality problems. Yeah, definitely. How's Irene doing in her new relationship? Fine. Oops, I can't tell any more than that because she's in my women's survivors group. Marilyn has been acting so strange lately. No kidding. I know something about this, but I can't say anything because she's in my coming out group. Sheesh. How's Linda? Seen Joyce lately? We can't talk about them. They're in our ACA group. Haha, yeah. Gardening. Lilith of the wildwood of the fair places. To fear you, to hate you, to despise you, to love you, Lilith of the wildwood, Lilith of the fair places, who eats her own children, who is cursed of God, mother of us all. Growing Avocados by Ruth Ann Robson. The lovely Gorgon painted by or drawn by Laura Kay. They will know me by my teeth. I am the wall at the lip of the water by Judy Grant. It's a photo of Elena Dyke Woman. Big Dykes with Attitude. Lyrics by Karen Eskovich and Elliot. Dykes Ignite. Very beautiful poster. Safe at Home, Softball as a Place of Refuge by Yvonne Zipter. Every dropped ball helps another woman. If you think someone is gay and you don't have enough proof to satisfy your curiosity, asking the question, have you ever played softball, may be a solution. Caring, Never Out of Season. It's another old Dykes to Watch Out For comic from 1988. Oh, there's another one. I've also noticed in Lesbian Connection they print old comics from Dykes to Watch Out For. Lesbian Stew. This summer I'm going to learn to eat tofu. Yuck. Tofu, miso, and soya. Oh God. More Dykes to Watch Out For. How do you resolve your vegetarian principles with your leather jacket? I bought it used. Oh, God. That was by Chris Kovic. Colivia Carter. What the well-dressed dyke will wear. This is great, actually. Let's see. Drag. Let's just read this little excerpt. Why are women forced to dress in certain ways? Because our clothes help keep us oppressed. At a transvesticism panel, a woman said that male transvestites made her very angry. She hated the way they minced and pranced and imitated all the superficial woman stereotypes. It occurred to me while she was saying this that the male TVs act like that partially because they are wearing those clothes. It is the function of feminine clothes to make a woman dependent, helpless, silly, decorative object. The time that Alex looked like Jan Morris was when Penny and I were getting into lady drag for a part in my slideshow, What the Well-Dressed Dyke Will Wear, that I was preparing for the lesbian history exploration. It was last March. The point of these pictures was to show how absurd we would look in drag and how absurd straight women really look. Later, I decided not to use the whole drag series. We were all supposed to dress subtly and tastefully, the way a chic working woman might look on an informal occasion. None of us really knew how this lady would dress, but we tried. I wore navy wool midi skirt, red tights, brown shoes, a flowered blouse, rings, choke necklace, eye makeup, and lipstick. Penny wore a khaki dress, blue tights, clogs, rings, necklace, and makeup. Alex wore a knit mini skirt, brown tights, light blue turtleneck shirt, red shawl, clogs, and makeup. Penny had been out less than a year and had not yet acquired her dyke look, so she really just looked like a straight woman. Alex looked like that pretend woman. When I tried to set up the tripod, I discovered that one leg kept collapsing. It took it inside to fix it. And it was as if I had suddenly become another woman. I couldn't get my balance kneeling. I had trouble using the screwdriver. My eyes wouldn't focus properly. I had to take off my skirt and high heels before I could fix the tripod. Hair. My mother loved the way I looked in overalls when I was 6. She cut my hair very short. I decided to grow it when I got sick of everybody calling me a boy. I didn't like boys. A few months after I came out with my hair I cut my hair short. I did it because I wanted to identify myself with dyke culture and because I was no longer afraid of being called a boy or a dyke. Long hair is a patriarchal symbol of femininity. I'm beginning to use hair as a political barometer. Long hair usually indicates that a dyke is trying to pass. Most dykes with long hair will deny this. They will say that they just like long hair. I'm sure they do. But why? Last March I shaved my head. I had been planning to do it for several months. Finally, I saw 3 women in Woodstock, New York, who had shaved their heads about 2 weeks before. At first they looked so startling. Then after a few minutes my eyes got adjusted. I felt their heads, and each one felt different. Several women were talking to them about it. Some were touching their fuzzy heads. I loved it. So I set the date for the beginning of spring, then convinced my straight neighbor, who has a beauty salon, to shave my head. She thought I was kidding, but finally she was convinced. Alex, Smokey, Mary, and Adrian came over to watch. It took 2 hours. My hair was quite short to start, but only about 1 inch long, was short to start, about only 1 inch long. But I have extraordinarily thick hair. Doretha had to use a scissors, electric razor, clipper, and straight razor with shaving cream. Alex took pictures of my slideshow, and everyone was laughing and being festive. When it was done, I could feel my friends talking over my head. I could feel their breath. It was freezing cold, so I had to wear a hat most of the time. But my head felt so fantastic, and I could see how round and smooth it was. No lumps. We could practically see the hairs grow overnight. Fuzz began to stick to it. Hats came off inside out, and it was noisy when anyone patted it. After about 1 week, Alex said that it was like a Velcro bowling ball. It was very exciting. Sometimes I would look in the mirror, and it was like looking at an entirely different woman. When my hair was about half an inch long, I had a full covering. Hot dyke. Makeup, long hair, dresses, stockings, high heels, etc. are the basic uniforms of women. I refuse to wear feminine clothes because I know why I am supposed to. I would just as soon wear a ball and chain, and to pretend that one can transcend the meaning and effect of these clothes is bullshit. Fashions do not happen by accident. Clothes have a function and a meaning. I don't want to wear blue jeans and suits for the rest of my life. In fact, I'm already tired of them. But our revolution is still young. I am confident that there will begin to evolve a true dyke fashion, just as dyke music and theater is already beginning. I have one idea what these clothes will look like, but I have no idea what these clothes will look like, but I do know that they will be liberating physically and psychologically, and they will be beautiful. This isn't herbal anymore. It's another Sooty Raccoon, Sooty Raccoon. And another chosen family. Fashion flash. Attention, dykes everywhere. Are you aware that often you unwittingly dress like a lesbian? Why would Kenneth Marie wear something like that? It makes her look like a lesbian. Mom, what a trooper. What a coincidence, Auntie. Another one by Sadie Raccoon, and then another photo by Jean Weisinger. The Great White Folk Music Myth. So what? There are 4 main reasons why, in my opinion, it is destructive to perpetuate the myth that women's music has always been and still is a WGWG genre. What does that mean? WG. Am I missing something? White girl with guitar. My bad. 1. It's historically untrue. We have always been an incredibly diverse network in terms of musical style. A review of a festival stage lineups over the years is most educational. Pam Hall by Tony Armstrong Jr. I am Pam Hall, 5th generation dyke. I don't sing to educate the straight world about lesbianism or feminism. I sing for the sisters. Kay Gardner by Tony Armstrong Jr. Early East Coast Women's Music and the Squirrel by Kay Gardner. Dykes in a Truck. Jamie Anderson and Bonnie Morris by Tony Armstrong Jr. So this is about like women's music of the late 80s, early 90s. Here are a lot of this section. Interviews. More artists. Castleberry and Dupree. Sue Fink. Look at that hair. Wow. And that jacket. More interviews. Sue Fink with Brent. Damn, look at that. Look at that hair. Sue Fink, man. I've never listened to Sue Fink, honestly. I'll say that. The Waiting for the Festival Lesbian Jam. Michigan, about the Michigan Women's Music Festival from 1984. More stuff about Michigan Women's Music Festival in here. I'm just going to skip over this. Again, more. Here's an image of Michigan Women's Music Festival. And here's some images of women there. This one's about the East Coast Lesbians Festival. Why it's different than others. Women's community design. Pagoda Temple of Love, a lesbian spiritual and cultural community. Where do dreams go when they die? The Spread of Consumerism, Goodbye Community by Lee Evans. The search for newness stems from and fosters alienation and disconnectedness. The point of lesbian community is to separate from the status quo and base our connections on a different set of values. Talking Lesbian by Alex Dobkin. Now, if you want higher consciousness, I'll tell you what to do. You've got to talk to a woman and let her talk to you. You've got to build you a consciousness and make it strong. And if we all stick together, girls, it won't be long. We'll have more friends, better friends, and more fun. It's like living in the country. Of course, it ain't quite so simple, so I better explain just why you've got to ride on that lesbian train. 'Cause if you wait for the man to straighten out your head, y'all be awaiting. And then you'll be dead and gone to heaven all alone. Remember all those sweet, dear, cute, devoted women friends of yours? You passed them all by, a damn shame. Suppose you're working so hard it's just outrageous, and your life hasn't improved in ages. You go to the man, but he doesn't relate to a woman's mind or a woman's state. Well, he's puffing his ego up, feeling masculine. He's got the whole world, he thinks, to stick it in. He looks out the window, and what does he see but a million women, and they all agree. Go stick it in some mud. Now, girls, you'll come to the hardest time. The man will try to hand you every line. He'll plead, argue, sulk, and the like. He'll call every one of you a goddamn dyke, man-hater, castrator. Men are human beings, too, 50%. The title of the book is in the title of this live stream, if that's not clear. But working in the kitchen, here's what we found. Scrubbing the floors, here's what we found. Raising the children, here's what we found. And being with each other, this is what we found. That if we don't let maneuvering keep us apart, if we don't let manipulation keep us apart, if we don't let manpower keep us apart, or mankind keep us apart, we're there. We didn't get it easy, but we got it. Sappho, Rediscovering Lesbian Space. The Midwest Lesbian Conference and Music Festival poster. This is a lovely poster. A celebration of Amazons. Documenting the Dyke Conference by Joan E. Nixon. Another piece by Sudi Rakusin. Very lovely. Leaping Lesbians by Sue Fink and Jocelyn Grippo. Some Reflections on Separatism and Power by Marilyn Fry. If you are doing something that is so strictly forbidden by the patriarchs, you must be doing something right. Abortion seems to be the most publicly emotional and most physically dramatic ground on which the theme of separation and male parasitism is presently played out. No Dobermans Allowed, a dramatic argument for separatist theater by Carolyn Gage. Walking Our Boundaries by Audre Lorde. A Mind-Life Ritual by Judith Barrington. Letters to the Editor, September 1972. Lavender Editors and Lesbian Sisters. In the last issue of Lavender, there was an article which disturbed me greatly. In my opinion, this article was plagiarized, not the wording, but the style, a plagiarism of a style which is used by Black writers. As a Black person, this does not shock or surprise me, as behind most great Black innovators, there is always some white imitator. The article I am referring to, "A pickle used to be a cucumber and other lesbians some such," was to me a pickle. It took me quite a while to read this article in its entirety, and not because I read slow, but the article was like reading a bunch of sentences that were stuck together without any punctuation. It lacked enough connectiveness to connect it together. Example, "And she's right which leads me to my article last issue about how straight people will kill us off. Some women didn't like it. That's an understatement. Lightfoot thinks I'm ready to take up guns and kill off the straight people. It took me a while to figure out just what Lightfoot thought or what I think she thinks, but I still do not know. But with double messages being here to stay, it is difficult to know anything. But I do know that I don't feel that those pricks with their insane mouthings did in Rayla. Or, as Mick Jagger said, I shouted out who killed the Kennedys when after all it was you and me. But I do know that if some sister gives only 2 bits to the treasury, I have some responsibility to her, 'cause those 2 bits helped. And I know that no white man would call a Black Panther a lazy N-word, 'cause even white men know there ain't no such thing as a lazy panther, and the only way to deal with an animal is to shoot it. And when was the last time a lesbian was shot on the street, or as she slept? And by the time I got my instructions, now burn this and memorize yourself, I was burning. 'Cause the word memorize in relation to the self is to me an absurdity, as memorize is derived from a Latin word, memoria, and Latin makes me think of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church is full of people memorizing and never thinking, learning, being, and loving yourself. And the headquarters of the Mormon Church is in Europe, not Africa. Which brings me, of the Roman Church is in Europe, not in Africa. Which brings me back to the beginning, my accusation of plagiarism. There is no way that a Black woman poet could use the style of a white woman poet to write poetry. And there is also no way a white woman can use a Black style. A beautiful example the most Black sisters and some white sisters should be able to relate to is a punctualness article written by Margaret E. Sloan, which appears in the 2nd edition of Ms. In Sisterhood, Vernita M. Gray. I Am Not Your Princess by Christos. She Who Would Despise Me. Another lovely image by Sudi Rasukin. Really used a lot of her art in here. So there she is again. Oh, wow, I was just thinking about this poem like the other night. Shall we read it? For the White Person Who Wants to Know How to Be My Friend by Pat Parker. The first thing you do is forget that I'm Black. Second, you must never forget that I'm Black. You should be able to dig Aretha, but don't play her every time I come over. And if you decide to play Beethoven, don't tell me his life story. They made us take music appreciation too. Eat soul food if you like it, but don't expect me to locate your restaurants or cook it for you. And if some Black person insults you, mugs you, rapes your sister, rapes you, rips your house, or is being an ass, please do not apologize to me for wanting to do them bodily harm. It makes me wonder if you're foolish. In other words, if you really want to be my friend, don't make a labor of it. I'm lazy, remember? Do You Remember Me by Barbara MacDonald. My Old Dyke's Home Screen. Reference work. The Wikidary, oh my god, by Mary Daly in cahoots with Jane Caputi. Speaking Freely by Julia Penelope. Another Mother Tongue by Judy Gran. Lesbian Peoples, I can't make out who it is. A Feminist Dictionary. A Woman's Thesaurus. Webster's Old Patriarchal Imperialist Dictionary. Oh wow, I want that. Finding Self, Finding Words. One of the beautiful things in this work, I'm going to hold up a little bit closer. There's often these beautiful little lesbian Venus symbols that are spread out in the passages, which just add a nice little touch. Some historical background. Lavender Woman, Volume 1, Number 1, November 1971. A lesbian newspaper. Oh, what is Alice getting up to? Alice and the Queen is drawn by Susan Moore. Lavender Woman Collective Statement. Lesbians like the Red Queen and Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass live in a slow sort of country. We do a lot of running just to stay in the same place. We do a lot of running from ourselves, from our identity, from our so-called straight sisters. We often find ourselves running from job to avoid being recognized. We often lose our status, our seniority, our raises. Often we find ourselves running from sister to sister, looking for love, validation, recognition, that we must eventually find in ourselves, in our self-acceptance. The Lavender Woman is a collective attempt to stop running, to stand still and firm in our places, so that we can stop depleting ourselves with evasion, manipulation, and all those other defenses we've needed for our survival. We have to stop running in order to grow. We have to stop running from ourselves, from our sisters, to turn around and face one another, confront one another, love one another. We need to let it be, let ourselves be. We need to say loud and clear who we are and where we are going. A lesbian relationship, we are beginning to discover, is not a hazard or a liability, but a gift and a virtue, a strengthening, redeeming relationship in which we mutually confirm our identities as women, in which we are free to let ourselves be real, rather than meet a male sexist stereotype which society is always holding up for us to clumsily imitate. Our awkwardness, we discover, is grace. Our so-called ugliness is beauty. In this world, everything is upside down. We are through the looking glass. Straight society seems dull, unreal, several layers from the truth. Our failure to meet straight standards of behavior is our ultimate success as real women. In this sense, lesbianism is a powerful, revolutionary force within the women's movement, a kind of avant-garde, as Flo Kennedy points out. We are the first women who have elected to survive without men. We even find ourselves being exploited by straight sisters in women's liberation who see lesbianism as a kind of revolutionary bandwagon they can jump on to get there quicker. We are attacked by supposedly non-sexist gay men because we prefer to meet by ourselves and recognize ourselves as a separate group in the gay liberation movement. These and other challenges we are learning to face head on. We found that running from them gets us nowhere. If we speak the truth from where we see it, we can keep our heads and our souls together. We can keep others from foisting off their truths onto us or speaking for us. Only then will we be able to honestly contribute to a revolutionary movement which groups working separately at their own liberation from where they are at, coverage toward a common goal, the reworking of the sexist and racist society closer to the heart's desire, a society based on real human need. Lovely. Black Lesbian by Margaret. Let's read this. What have you got to offer us? You wonder where we are, and we say right in front of you. You offer us psychological rhetoric, and we give you feelings and emotions which you charge are loud and violent. You cry dry tears while we bleed. You like to watch us dance for you, but you never ask us to dance with you. You imagine, think, and fantasize we fuck better, which either keeps you on our backs or miles away. You assume we are mostly all dykes, and the femme in us you try to butch. You use our blackness as an excuse more than we do, and you never try to see the pain behind all our laughter. When you are around us, you talk black, and we find ourselves talking white. And you even come to our parties, bringing a 1969 Aretha Franklin record, and when we confront you, you say we're too powerful to deal with, and you can't come to our neighborhood after dark except in groups when your men have raped us. You too, for over 300 years. I can't call you my sister until you stop participating in my oppression. You can't have a struggle without all oppressed people, and black women, particularly black lesbians, have struggled harder than anyone. You need us, and we can work and will work with you, if only you accept us where we've been, where we are, and where we come from. This is a bunch of different lesbian publishers and press. Amazon ABC. Pictures by Roberta Gregory. A, you're an Amazon. B, coming great, brave and strong. Clearly and consciously you see. D, you're so dykey. How you excite me. How fortunate a female faculty. G, I guess it's good for me. H, how heavenly. I never knew how butchy I could be. J for sweet justice, K for sweet kisses, Lesbian for letting go of MEN, etc. Our cursory and precursory history of language and the telling of it by Julia Penelope. Those of us alive now will never be whole. That's quite a statement. But we'll die on the way to regaining our full woman power. Others who come after us will be the women we aspire to be. How I wish that were true, Julia. The Remember Rooms. A map of the Wander Ground. This is the first cover of Sinister Wisdom. We're almost done here, flipping through. Conclusion. What we began with this wave of lesbian moving, at least in the US, has gone through significant changes. As we discovered and began to explore ourselves, we wanted to create something new, and we set about doing just that. We were and still are boundary dwellers. It's another one by Sudi Rasukin. This is Jamaica by Jean Weisinger. The Warwicks. Yeah, we're done. Wow. I can't believe we got through. This is the back of the book. Julia Penelope is the author of Call Me Lesbian, Lesbian Lives, Lesbian Theory, and Speaking Freely. Unlearning the Lies of the Father's Tongues. The co-author of Bound Goddesses and co-editor of International Feminist Fiction, Sexism in Language, The Original Coming Out Stories, Finding the Lesbians, and For Lesbians Only. Susan J. Wolfe, professor and chair of the Department of English at the University of South Dakota. She has published numerous articles on sexism and homophobia in language use, on the linguistic reconstruction of proto-culture, and on feminist aesthetics. She is co-editor of The Coming Out Stories, The Original Coming Out Stories, and Sexual Practice, Textual Theory, Lesbian Cultural Criticisms. For those who don't think that lesbians constitute our own complete world, read Lesbian Culture and Anthology and Think Again. That's Alex Dobkin. Lesbian Culture is a rich compendium of lesbian life and lore. It is the completely lesbian handbook to our culture that every complete lesbian needs. That is by Carla J. There has never been anything like this one-volume treasure of lesbian memorabilia, documents, poetry, fiction, autobiographies, and essays on everything from film to softball. Its publication is in itself a significant event in lesbian culture. Another excellent resource by two of the best lesbian scholars and writers. Within the pages of this anthology, I rediscovered the compelling creativity of the dynamic lesbian artists, poets, and writers whose inspiration encouraged me to come out a decade ago. They made the invisible visible then. But lesbian culture is not a retrospective. It unites the voices and works of our foremothers and sisters, for us and for those who will follow. Terry de la Pena. This was published by the Crossing Press in Freedom, California. And yes, this lovely cover has this image with the classic Dyke sign. I actually have a Facebook friend that got her picture taken in front of this sign, so it's a piece. Yeah, thank you all for being here. I actually am surprised I went through the whole booklet. As you can see, it's massive. And I want to thank those of you who voted for us doing it. I am interested in looking at some of the other pieces that I put up in that poll. So I think the next one in popularity was the Holy Book of Women's Mysteries. So the next time I do a look through, we're going to look at that. Yeah, thanks for being here. Don't forget to like the video. You can click out of the chat and just go do that now. And share it if you enjoyed it. And also feel free to return to it if you so like, or if you think anyone needs to see this. All right. I will be back another time. Thank you. And stay safe and, be good to one another.